I drained my entire life savings, every single penny I had sweated over for a decade, to fund my younger sister's high society wedding. I did it to save my parents from what they swore was absolute financial ruin. But the ink on my $45,000 check had not even dried when my sister slid a gold-stamped velvet envelope across the kitchen table. It was not an invitation. It was a list of 6 humiliating conditions I had to follow just to be allowed in the building. I refused to be their stepping stone. I mailed them one final gift and watched their elite country club facade collapse into dust before the vows were even spoken. Before I tell you what was in that box and how I legally dismantled their lies, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this story. Drop a comment and let me know where you are watching from and what time it is there. Now let me take you back to the evening my family tried to sell me out. My name is Sarah Jenkins. I am 32 years old, and I work as a payroll manager at a mid-sized logistics firm in Ohio. My daily life consists of spreadsheets, tax compliance, and ensuring hundreds of employees get their hard-earned paychecks on time. I drive a 10-year-old Toyota that rattles violently when it hits 60 miles an hour on the highway. For the past 7 years, I have worked 60-hour weeks. I pack my own lunches every single day, usually just a turkey sandwich and an apple. I brew my coffee at home to save $4 a day. I live in a tiny one-bedroom apartment with paper-thin walls where I can hear the neighbors arguing every night. I did all of this sacrificing for one specific reason. I wanted to buy my own house. I had meticulously saved $45,000. That money was my down payment. That money was my future, my security, and my proof that my hard work meant something. The emergency call came on a Tuesday night in late October. My mother, Susan, was sobbing so hard through the phone that I could barely understand her words. She told me to come to the house immediately. She said it was a matter of family survival. I dropped my dinner in the trash, grabbed my keys, and drove straight to the 4-bedroom suburban home I grew up in. When I walked through the front door, the atmosphere was thick and suffocating. My father, Richard, was sitting at the formal dining room table with his head buried in his hands. My mother was pacing the hardwood floor, wringing a tissue until her knuckles were white. And my younger sister, Chloe, 28 years old and newly engaged, was weeping openly on the living room sofa. I rushed into the room, my heart pounding against my ribs. I asked what happened and if someone was sick. My father looked up, his eyes bloodshot and heavy with defeat. He pointed to a stack of manila folders scattered across the table. He told me that they were losing the house. His voice was thick with shame as he explained that the medical bills from my mother's back surgery 2 years ago had buried them. He claimed they took out a second mortgage to cover the hidden costs, and now they had fallen completely behind. He said the bank was threatening immediate foreclosure. I stood there absolutely stunned. My parents had never once mentioned being in financial trouble. They always maintained a flawless image in our neighborhood. They hosted lavish block parties, drove leased luxury SUVs, and always bought designer brands. But what did this have to do with Chloe, I asked, looking at my sister whose sobs were growing louder by the second. My mother stepped forward and grabbed my hands. Her grip was tight and desperate. She choked out that it was about Chloe's wedding. She reminded me about Brad Montgomery, Chloe's fiancé. Everyone in our town knew the Montgomery family. They were generational old money. They owned massive commercial real estate blocks, luxury car dealerships, and practically ran the board of the local country club. Brad was their golden boy. My mother, with tears streaming down her face, explained that Brad's parents were expecting a traditional high-end luxury wedding. They were inviting their influential business partners, the local mayor, and several judges. As the bride's family, my parents were traditionally expected to pay for the venue, the 5-star catering, and the imported flowers. If my parents admitted they were bankrupt, if they confessed they were facing foreclosure, the Montgomery family would force Brad to cancel the wedding. My mother cried that Patricia Montgomery would never allow her prestigious son to marry into a family of destitute failures. Chloe looked up at me from the sofa, her expensive mascara running in dark streaks down her cheeks. She cried that Brad was the love of her life. She sobbed that his mother already judged her for not having a trust fund, and if they could not pay for this wedding, she would lose him forever. She begged me, saying her entire future was on the line. I looked at the three of them, my family, the people who were supposed to love and protect me. The words tasted like dry ash in my mouth when I finally asked how much they needed to save the wedding. My father silently slid a piece of paper across the polished mahogany table. It was a printed budget breakdown. The exclusive country club venue, the imported white roses, the live orchestra, the 5-star catering. The total at the bottom of the page was exactly $45,000. I physically stepped back from the table. I told them that was my entire house fund. I raised my voice, reminding them that it was every single dollar I had saved since I was 25 years old. I told them how hard I worked, how I drove a car that barely ran, how I had not taken a single vacation in over 5 years just to build a safety net for myself. My mother stepped closer, her tone shifting into a pleading, manipulative whisper. She said they knew how hard I worked and they would never ask if it was not a matter of life or death. She framed it as a matter of family honor. She told me I was a payroll manager with a steady, reliable job and that I could simply save the money up again over the next few years. She called me practical and strong traits she used to justify why I could handle the burden. But Chloe needed this, she insisted. Our family needed this to survive the crushing public shame. She begged me not to let my sister's life fall apart just because I wanted to buy a house a few years earlier. They completely surrounded me. The tears, the desperate begging, the suffocating weight of familial duty pressed down on my shoulders. In the Jenkins family, I was always the reliable workhorse. I was the one who fixed the problems, paid the bills, and stayed quietly in the background so others could shine. I looked at Chloe trembling on the couch, genuinely terrified of losing the wealthy lifestyle she desperately craved. I looked at my parents supposedly on the absolute brink of losing the home I grew up in. I felt physically sick to my stomach. A deep twisting pain anchored itself in my chest. But they were my blood. You do not let your family drown when you have a life raft, even if it means you have to keep treading water yourself. I reached into my worn leather purse and pulled out my checkbook. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold the pen steady. I wrote out the date. I wrote the name of the elite wedding planner my mother had selected. And then I wrote the amount. $45,000. I signed my name, effectively signing away 7 years of my life, my sweat, and my independence. I tore the check from the book and placed it softly on the dining room table. I whispered that I hoped this would fix everything, expecting them to pull me into a tight hug. I expected relief. I expected profound gratitude. But the exact moment the paper check left my fingers, the entire atmosphere in the room shifted. It was immediate and chilling. Chloe stopped crying instantly. She sat up straight on the sofa, calmly wiping her dry cheeks. My mother's desperate, pleading posture vanished in a second, replaced by a rigid, businesslike stance. My father did not say a word. He simply picked up the check, blew on the wet ink, folded it perfectly in half, and tucked it into his shirt pocket. No one said thank you. No one hugged me. Instead, Chloe reached down into her designer handbag and pulled out a thick cream-colored velvet envelope. It was stamped with an elaborate gold foil crest. She walked over and slid it across the wooden table toward me. I asked what it was, staring at the luxurious velvet, wondering if it was my formal invitation to the wedding I just paid for. Chloe exchanged a quick, knowing look with my mother. It was a look I could not quite decipher at the time, but it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Chloe's voice was completely devoid of the panic I had heard just 2 minutes earlier. She told me it was my bridal party packet. She casually mentioned that since I was going to be at the wedding, she and Mom had put together some guidelines to make sure the day went smoothly and fit the Montgomery family's elite aesthetic. I reached out and opened the envelope. My hands were still trembling from writing away my life savings. I slid out a heavy, textured piece of cardstock. It was not a schedule of events. It was a printed list of 6 non-negotiable conditions. 6 rules I had to follow if I wanted to be allowed at the event I had just purchased. I began to read the list. The elegant cursive words, blurred together at first, but as they came into focus, the reality of what I was reading hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Number 1. You are strictly forbidden from discussing the financial arrangements of this wedding with anyone. If any guest, especially a member of the Montgomery family, asks who paid for the event, you will state clearly that Richard and Susan Jenkins provided all the funds. Number 2. You will dye your hair a muted brown and wear the approved dull beige dress. We cannot have your current style clashing with the elegant old money aesthetic of the bridal party. Number 3. You will immediately step down as maid of honor. Brad's wealthy sister Victoria will take the role. It is crucial that the Montgomery family feels centered, honored, and respected during the ceremony. Number 4. You will be seated at table 12 located near the kitchen entrance. The family table at the front of the ballroom is reserved for the Montgomerys and the immediate wedding party only. Number 5. You will arrive at the country club no later than 5 o'clock in the morning to coordinate the floral deliveries, the caterers, and the valets. You will act as the unpaid point of contact for all vendors throughout the day. Number 6. You will leave the venue immediately after the cake cutting before the formal professional family portraits are taken. We need the final wedding album to reflect a consistent high society appearance without any distractions. I read the list 3 times. My brain simply refused to process the calculated cruelty printed on that heavy cardstock. I had just handed them $45,000. I had just sacrificed my home, my future, and my financial security to save them from ruin. And they were treating me like an embarrassing hired servant who was too ugly to be seen in the official photographs. I looked up at my mother, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper, as I asked if this was some kind of sick joke. I asked if she really expected me to sit by the swinging kitchen doors and leave before the family pictures. My mother crossed her arms tightly over her chest, looking down at me with cold, calculating eyes. She told me not to be dramatic. Her tone was sharp and entirely dismissive. She stated that the Montgomerys were high society, bringing state senators and corporate executives to this wedding. She looked me up and down and bluntly said that I was just a back-office worker. She told me my vibe, my clothes, and my overall presentation simply did not fit their legacy photos. She said she was merely asking me to be a team player for my sister. I stood up from the table, the chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. I yelled that I had just paid for the entire wedding, every single dime, and she wanted me to hide in the back of the room like a dirty secret she was ashamed of. Chloe sighed heavily, rolling her eyes as if my utter devastation was merely an annoying inconvenience to her afternoon planning. She waved a hand flippantly and said, I was so practical that I did not even care about fancy parties or high-end photos anyway. She told me Victoria Montgomery had the right wealthy look for the maid of honor and I would just look out of place standing next to her. She then actually had the nerve to ask why I was making her special day all about my feelings. I looked over at my father, waiting for him to step in. I waited for him to defend his eldest daughter after taking all of my money. He just looked down at his expensive watch and walked toward the kitchen. He casually called over his shoulder that I needed to listen to my mother because we all have our roles to play. I stood in the dining room of my childhood home, clutching the velvet envelope in my hand. The $45,000 check was already deeply buried in my father's pocket. I knew the non-refundable deposits for the country club were already legally binding. I had been completely ambushed. I was manipulated into handing over my entire life savings under the false guise of family survival, only to be instantly shoved into the shadows like unwanted garbage. They thought I would just cry, swallow the massive disrespect, and do exactly what I was told. They thought because I was quiet, practical, and reliable, I was weak. But as I stared at the smug, entitled smile on my younger sister's face, a cold, unfamiliar clarity washed over me. I did not scream. I did not tear the cardstock into pieces. I simply folded the list of conditions, placed it neatly back into the velvet envelope, and walked out the front door without another word. I decided right then that I would play their game. I would follow their exact conditions. But they were about to learn a very hard, devastating lesson. When you push the family workhorse too far, you do not get quiet compliance. You get a meticulous payroll manager who knows exactly how to settle an unbalanced ledger, and I had absolutely nothing left to lose. I made it exactly 3 steps down the front concrete walkway before the sheer absurdity of the situation rooted my feet to the ground. The cold October wind was whipping through my thin coat, but I barely felt it. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I held the heavy cream-colored velvet envelope in my hand. Inside was the list of 6 conditions my family expected me to follow after I had just handed them my entire life savings of $45,000. I looked back at the house. The living room lights cast a warm golden glow through the front windows. It looked like a picture-perfect suburban home, but I knew the rot that lived inside it. I could not just walk away into the night and let them think they had won. I turned around, marched back up the steps, pushed the heavy oak front door wide open, and walked straight back into the dining room. My father was still sitting at the table examining the check I had just written him. My mother and Chloe were huddled near the kitchen island, whispering excitedly about floral arrangements. They all froze when I walked back in. I did not yell. I did not throw a tantrum. I walked right up to the mahogany dining table, pulled the thick piece of cardstock from the velvet envelope, and slapped it down on the polished wood. I looked directly at my mother and asked if she wanted to explain the rules she had just handed me. Susan blinked, her expression tightening into a mask of polite irritation. She told me there was nothing to explain and that the guidelines were perfectly clear. I told her I wanted to read them out loud, just to make sure I fully understood the incredible terms of my own financial ruin. I picked up the cardstock. My voice was dangerously calm as I read the first condition. I am strictly forbidden from discussing the financial arrangements of this wedding with anyone. If any guest asks who paid for the event, I must state clearly that Richard and Susan Jenkins provided all the funds. I looked at my parents. I asked if they really planned to parade around the country club accepting praise from the wealthy Montgomery family for funding a luxury wedding while the daughter who actually emptied her bank account was forced to lie to protect their fragile egos. My father looked away, suddenly very interested in the grain of the hardwood floor. I did not wait for an answer. I moved to condition number 2. I must dye my hair a muted color and wear a dull beige dress so my appearance does not clash with the elegant aesthetic of the bridal party. For my entire adult life, I have worn my hair in a vibrant auburn shade. It is the one physical feature I truly love about myself. Chloe had chosen blush pink and champagne gold for her bridesmaids. I asked Chloe why I was being ordered to look like a piece of drab wallpaper. Chloe crossed her arms and defensively stated that her future mother-in-law, Patricia Montgomery, had very specific tastes. Chloe whined that auburn hair was too loud and would pull focus in the candid photographs. I shook my head in utter disbelief and read the third condition. I am required to immediately step down as maid of honor, so Brad's wealthy sister, Victoria Montgomery, can take the role. This was a stab directly to my chest. When we were little girls playing dress-up in the backyard, Chloe and I had promised we would be each other's maid of honor. Now I was being casually discarded just so my sister could suck up to a woman who possessed a trust fund. I stared at Chloe and asked if my lifetime of supporting her meant absolutely nothing compared to Victoria Montgomery's social status. Chloe simply rolled her eyes, complaining that Victoria was already part of the country club board and knew exactly how to mingle with the elite guests. I swallowed the lump forming in my throat and continued to the fourth condition. I will be seated at table 12, located next to the swinging doors of the catering kitchen, instead of the family table at the front of the ballroom. The family table was reserved exclusively for the Montgomerys and the immediate wedding party. I asked my mother how she could possibly justify banishing her own flesh and blood to the absolute worst seat in the entire venue, hiding me next to the waitstaff right after taking $45,000 from me. Susan sighed loudly, clearly annoyed that I was making this difficult for her. The fifth condition was perhaps the most insulting from a purely practical standpoint. I am required to arrive at the country club no later than 5 o'clock in the morning to coordinate the floral deliveries, manage the caterers, and act as the unpaid point of contact for all vendors throughout the entire day. I let out a dry, humorless laugh. I looked at my parents and stated that I was not a guest at this wedding. I was not a sister or a daughter. I was a glorified, unpaid intern who had somehow been tricked into paying for her own internship. I was expected to manage the logistics of an event I was actively being hidden from. But the sixth and final condition was the one that truly shattered whatever illusion of family I had left. I am mandated to leave the venue immediately after the cake cutting, long before the formal professional family portraits are taken. The reasoning printed on the cardstock was that the final wedding album needed to reflect a consistent high society appearance without any distractions. I dropped the heavy cardstock onto the table. I looked at the three people standing in front of me. I asked them if they realized what they were doing. I asked if they understood that they were physically erasing me from the family history. I was not allowed to be in the photos. I was not allowed to be seen. I was only allowed to exist as a wallet. My mother stepped forward. She did not look guilty. She did not look ashamed. She looked like a general commanding a battlefield. She looked me dead in the eye and told me to stop being so deeply dramatic. Her voice was ice-cold, completely devoid of any maternal warmth. She told me I needed to face reality. She said the Montgomery family represented the highest tier of local society. They were bringing influential politicians, corporate executives, and generational wealth into that ballroom. Susan pointed a manicured finger at me. She brutally stated that I was a back-office worker. She said I drove an embarrassing car, lived in a tiny apartment, and had no understanding of how high society functioned. She told me my vibe simply did not fit the legacy photos they were trying to curate for Brad and Chloe. She claimed that having a dowdy payroll manager standing in the front row of the wedding portraits would raise unwanted questions among the elite guests. I stood there paralyzed by the sheer venom in her words. I asked her if she really thought so little of me. I asked if my only value to this family was the balance in my checking account. Susan let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. She said I was completely missing the point. She told me that families have roles. Chloe was the beautiful, socially graceful daughter who was elevating the Jenkins family name by marrying into the Montgomery dynasty. She told me I was the practical daughter. She said my role was to be the reliable foundation that allowed my sister to soar. She demanded that I stop being selfish, put my hurt feelings aside, and be a team player for my sister's future. I turned to my father. I pleaded with him to say something. I asked him how he could stand there with my life savings in his pocket and let my mother speak to me this way. Richard shifted his weight uncomfortably. He refused to make eye contact with me. He stared at the kitchen cabinets and muttered that my mother made some valid points about the social dynamics of the event. He said it was just one day, just a few pictures, and I should not let my stubborn pride ruin Chloe's big moment. He completely washed his hands of me. I looked back at Chloe, my younger sister, the girl I had protected, tutored, and financially supported since we were teenagers. She was casually sipping a glass of water, looking at her freshly manicured nails. She told me that Victoria Montgomery had already bought a $4,000 designer gown for the maid of honor position. Chloe callously added that I could never afford something like that anyway, so she was actually doing me a favor by relieving me of the pressure. She smiled sweetly and said she knew I would understand because I was always so good at handling the boring, practical background details. A terrifying silence settled over the room. The air felt heavy, pressing down on my lungs. I realized in that exact moment that there was absolutely nothing I could say to reach them. There was no argument I could make, no plea I could offer, no tear I could shed that would make them view me as a human being. They had built an entire reality where my sole purpose on this earth was to be exploited for their comfort and status. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to snatch my check off the table, tear it into 100 pieces, and walk out of their lives forever. I wanted to burn the bridge right then and there. I wanted to tell them the wedding was off, that the Montgomerys could foot the bill, and that I was done being their sacrificial lamb. But my analytical brain, the mind of a payroll manager who calculates risks and outcomes for a living, slammed the brakes on my anger. I remembered the extensive paperwork I'd been forced to deal with over the past 3 weeks. My parents had claimed they were too overwhelmed with the stress of the potential foreclosure to deal with wedding vendors. They had insisted I handle the boring administrative tasks. I had personally signed the initial deposit agreements for the luxury venue, the high-end catering company, and the imported floral designs. I had used my own personal credit cards to secure those massive reservations, assuming the $45,000 check I just wrote to my father would balance the scales and cover the final invoices. If I tore up that check tonight and threw a massive screaming fit, my parents would simply cancel the wedding and blame me. But worse than that, the vendors would come after me for the cancellation fees and the remaining balances because my name was on the preliminary dotted lines. The non-refundable deposits alone were worth thousands of dollars. I was legally and financially trapped in a web they had carefully spun around me. If I walked away right now, I would lose a massive chunk of my savings anyway, and they would still paint themselves as the tragic victims of a jealous, bitter older sister. I looked at the smug, triumphant faces of my mother and sister. They were absolutely certain they had won. They believed they had successfully extracted my money while simultaneously putting me in my proper invisible place. They thought I was too weak, too desperate for their meager crumbs of affection to ever fight back. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my heart rate to steady. I locked my emotions away in a dark, cold box inside my mind. I reached out and picked up the velvet envelope from the table. I told them I understood. My voice was eerily calm, completely flat. I said I understood perfectly what my role was in this family. I told Susan that I would wear the beige dress, that I would manage the vendors at dawn, and that I would quietly leave before the formal family portraits. I promised I would not do a single thing to embarrass them in front of the Montgomery family. Chloe clapped her hands together, letting out a joyful little squeal. She rushed forward and threw her arms around my stiff, unresponsive body. She told me I was the best sister in the entire world, and that she knew I would do the right thing for her special day. My mother offered a satisfied nod, clearly pleased that she had successfully managed another crisis without having to compromise her vision. My father finally looked at me, offering a weak, pathetic smile of relief. I turned around and walked out the front door for the second time that night. I walked down the concrete path, got into my rattling 10-year-old Toyota and locked the doors. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my hands ached. I had given them my compliance. I had given them the verbal surrender they desperately wanted. But as I backed out of their driveway and drove into the dark streets of my hometown, a new razor-sharp determination crystallized in my mind. I was going to suffer through their ridiculous conditions for now. I was going to smile, nod, and play the role of the invisible, practical workhorse. But I was also going to go home and meticulously audit every single piece of paper, every digital signature, and every contract associated with this wedding. I knew there had to be a way out. I just had to find it. I resolved to survive the immediate humiliation because I knew that my forced compliance was about to place me directly on the path of a much darker secret one that would give me the power to destroy their high society illusions once and for all. The wrought iron gates of the Montgomery Valley Country Club towered over my battered 10-year-old Toyota like a silent judgment. The valet, a young man in a crisp white shirt and a black vest, actually hesitated before opening my door. He glanced at my faded upholstery, then at the sprawling, manicured lawns of the estate, clearly wondering if I had taken a wrong turn off the highway. I did not blame him. I felt like an intruder in my own life. I was wearing the dress my mother had mandated. It was a shapeless, knee-length beige garment that made my skin look washed out and entirely unremarkable. I had spent 2 hours that morning at a cheap salon dyeing my vibrant auburn hair to a dull, flat brown. Looking in the rearview mirror before I handed over my keys, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. I looked exactly how my family wanted me to look. Invisible. I popped the trunk, and the valet stepped forward to help, but my mother was suddenly there, tapping frantically on the glass of my window. Susan was dressed in a stunning navy silk suit, her hair perfectly styled. She yanked my car door open before the valet could even reach the handle. She hissed at me to hurry up, pointing to the 3 massive cardboard boxes sitting in my trunk. They were filled with custom monogrammed favor boxes, imported silk ribbons, and heavy glass centerpieces. She told me the event planners were running behind, and that I needed to carry everything up to the Magnolia Room immediately through the service entrance. She explicitly ordered me not to use the main lobby, because the Montgomery guests were already arriving and I was sweating. I grabbed the first box. It weighed at least 40 pounds. The handles cut deeply into my palms, but I kept my mouth shut. I hauled the boxes up a steep concrete ramp in the back of the building, my cheap beige heels slipping on the damp pavement. By the time I carried the third box into the extravagant ballroom, my back was aching, my newly dyed hair was sticking to my forehead, and my mandated beige dress was clinging to my damp skin. The Magnolia Room was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, sparkling light over dozens of round tables covered in pristine white linen. Towering arrangements of white orchids and hydrangeas filled the air with a heavy, sweet perfume. A string quartet was setting up in the corner, tuning their instruments. It was a scene straight out of a luxury bridal magazine. And looking around that magnificent room, a bitter realization settled heavily in my chest. My family had not paid a single dime for any of this. The floral arrangements, the classical musicians, the rented crystal flutes resting on the tables. All of it was funded by the $45,000 check I had written them 3 days ago. My years of eating cheap sandwiches and skipping vacations were currently hanging from the ceiling in the form of imported lighting. I tried to catch my breath near the catering doors, hoping to finally blend into the background and grab a glass of water. But Chloe spotted me. My sister looked radiant in a custom white lace cocktail dress. She was surrounded by a flock of wealthy women laughing and sipping bright pink mimosas. She caught my eye, completely ignored my exhausted appearance, and snapped her fingers at me. She pointed to an empty tray on a nearby table, then gestured toward the bar across the room. She did not use words. She just mouthed that she needed more drinks for her friends. For the next 2 hours, I did not sit down once. The bridal shower went from an elegant gathering to a chaotic spectacle of immense wealth. I was not treated as a guest. I was not treated as the bride's older sister. I was treated as an unpaid member of the country club staff. Whenever a guest handed Chloe a beautifully wrapped gift, Susan would snatch it and shove it into my arms, ordering me to stack them neatly in the corner. When the women tore the expensive wrapping paper off the presents, my father pointed to a large black garbage bag and told me to start clearing the mess before Patricia Montgomery noticed the clutter. I walked around the room, bending down in my cheap shoes, picking up torn tissue paper and discarded ribbons from around the polished shoes of local politicians and corporate wives. None of them made eye contact with me. If I accidentally brushed past someone, they would pull their designer dresses away and offer a tight, uncomfortable smile. I was a ghost haunting a party I had fully financed. The true devastation happened right before the formal luncheon was served. I was kneeling near the gift table trying to shove a massive pile of crushed cardboard into a heavy-duty trash bag. My back was turned to the room when the entire ballroom suddenly went completely quiet. The string quartet stopped playing. The low hum of wealthy gossip ceased. I stood up, wiping the sweat from my brow, and saw her. Patricia Montgomery had arrived. She was a formidable woman. She wore an emerald green dress that probably cost more than my car, and a diamond necklace that caught every ray of light in the room. She glided across the hardwood floor with the effortless confidence of a woman who owned the world and everyone in it. Chloe rushed forward to greet her future mother-in-law, practically vibrating with desperate enthusiasm. Susan and Richard were right behind her, their faces stretched into expressions of utter devotion. Patricia accepted their greetings with a cool, practiced grace. She kissed Chloe on both cheeks, complimented the floral arrangements, and nodded approvingly at the string quartet. Then her sharp, calculating eyes swept across the room and landed directly on me. I was standing 10 feet away holding a bulging black trash bag, wearing a dull beige dress with my flat brown hair plastered to my face. I looked like a janitor who had wandered into a royal court. Patricia raised a perfectly manicured eyebrow. She turned to Chloe, her tone polite, but laced with unmistakable disdain. She asked who the young woman handling the garbage was, mentioning that she thought the country club staff were required to wear formal black and white uniforms during private events. The air in the room grew incredibly dense. I froze my fingers, gripping the plastic trash bag so tightly my knuckles ached. This was the moment. This was the moment my sister was going to explain that I was not the hired help. I waited for Chloe to say my name. I waited for her to introduce me as her older sister, the woman who had helped her with her homework, the woman who had wiped her tears after her first heartbreak, the woman who had just handed over every penny she owned to make this very room a reality. Chloe let out a high-pitched musical laugh. She casually waved her hand in my direction, as if swatting away a mildly annoying insect. She looked Patricia Montgomery right in the eye and said the words that finally broke the last remaining thread of my familial loyalty. Chloe told her not to worry about the uniform. She smiled brightly and said, "Oh, she is just a distant cousin who does payroll at some logistics company. She is not used to these kinds of events, but she loves running errands for us. It keeps her busy. A distant cousin, who does payroll, who loves running errands." I stopped breathing. The plastic bag slipped slightly in my hands. I looked desperately at my parents, waiting for the correction. I waited for my father to clear his throat and tell this wealthy matriarch that I was his firstborn daughter. I waited for my mother to step in and defend my dignity. Instead, Richard and Susan Jenkins looked at Patricia Montgomery, raised their crystal champagne flutes, and laughed in complete agreement. My mother actually nodded her head, adding that I was always such a helpful little worker bee behind the scenes. Patricia offered a tight, dismissive smile, completely losing interest in my existence. She turned back to Chloe and suggested they move to the dining tables before the soup got cold. The group turned their backs on me and walked away. I stood paralyzed by the gift table. The psychological violence of that moment was absolute. They had not simply insulted me. They had completely erased my identity. They had legally and socially disowned me in front of 60 people to protect their fragile illusion of high society grandeur. They were deeply ashamed of me. I was not a daughter. I was not a sister. I was an ugly, convenient secret that they needed to sweep under the rug. I felt a crushing weight press down on my chest, threatening to shatter my ribs. But the humiliation of the day had not even reached its peak. The event coordinator chimed a small silver bell, signaling the guests to take their seats for the formal luncheon. I tied off the garbage bag, set it in the corner, and walked over to the grand seating chart displayed on a golden easel. I ran my finger down the alphabetical list, looking for table 12. I found the table number, but my name was not there. I scanned the entire board 3 times. Sarah Jenkins was completely absent from the list. Before I could ask the coordinator for help, my mother materialized beside me. She grabbed my upper arm, her fingernails digging painfully into my skin, and pulled me forcefully toward the kitchen hallway away from the glittering crowd. Her face was flushed with panic and irritation. She shoved me into the quiet, dimly lit corridor. She kept her voice low, but the venom in her words was entirely unrestricted. She told me there had been a complication. She aggressively whispered that Patricia Montgomery's sister had arrived unexpectedly from New York and brought 2 friends with her. The catering staff had to quickly reconfigure the seating arrangements to accommodate the VIP guests. I looked at my mother, completely confused. I asked where I was supposed to sit. I asked if they had moved me to a different table in the back. Susan let out an exasperated sigh, looking at me like I was a remarkably slow child. She explicitly stated that the elite seating was completely full. She said there were absolutely no chairs left in the ballroom. She crossed her arms and told me that it would be entirely inappropriate to squeeze a distant cousin onto a table of wealthy socialites anyway, especially after Chloe had already established my narrative to Patricia. I asked her what she expected me to do. The luncheon was scheduled to last for 2 hours. Susan did not even blink. She told me to go wait outside. She gestured toward the service exit at the end of the hallway. She said I could just go sit in my car or wait on the service patio until the luncheon was over. She claimed she would text me when it was time to help load the gifts into the vehicles. She patted my shoulder, a hollow, patronizing gesture, and told me to be a team player. Then she turned around and walked back into the warmth of the crystal-lit ballroom, leaving me entirely alone in the cold corridor. I pushed open the heavy metal service door and stepped out onto the concrete loading dock. The moment the door clicked shut behind me, the sky broke open. It had been gray and threatening all morning, but now a freezing torrential October rain began to pour down. I did not have an umbrella. I had left my coat in the trunk of my car, which was parked nearly a mile away in the overflow dirt lot, because the valet had refused to park it near the luxury vehicles. I stepped back under the tiny rusted metal awning above the loading dock. It barely covered my shoulders. The wind whipped the freezing rain against my legs. My beige dress clung to my shivering body. The cold seeped directly into my bones, a sharp, biting agony that mirrored the absolute desolation in my heart. I stood there shivering uncontrollably on a slab of wet concrete, listening to the muffled sounds of laughter and clinking glasses coming through the thick brick wall behind me. I looked through a small, rain-streaked window near the door. I could see the glow of the chandeliers. I could see the towering white orchids. I could see my family sitting at the head table smiling, eating a 5-star meal, and soaking in the admiration of a room full of strangers. They were sitting in a room I bought for them. They were eating food I paid for. They were basking in a luxury that I had sacrificed my youth, my comfort, and my future home to provide. And they had banished me to an alleyway in a freezing rainstorm because my presence embarrassed them. I hugged my arms around my chest, my teeth chattering violently. I waited for the tears to come. I waited for the familiar, pathetic sorrow of the rejected daughter to wash over me. I expected to cry. I expected to feel broken. But as the freezing rain lashed against my face, something remarkable happened. The sadness never came. The desperate, lifelong yearning for my parents' approval, the deep-rooted desire to be loved by my sister, it all completely evaporated in the cold air. The profound realization hit me with the force of a freight train. My family did not love me. They had never loved me. They did not view me as a human being with feelings, dreams, or dignity. They saw me as a biological ATM. They saw me as a servant. They could exploit, drain, and then lock outside in the rain when I was no longer useful. I stopped shivering. The physical cold was completely eclipsed by the icy, calculated rage spreading through my chest. I looked through that rain-streaked window one last time. I watched my mother raise a glass of champagne to toast her beautiful, wealthy new family dynamic. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully extracted my $45,000 and put the ugly practical daughter exactly where she belonged. They had absolutely no idea that by erasing my identity in front of that room, they had also erased every single ounce of loyalty, guilt, and obligation I had ever felt toward them. They forgot that the practical daughter was a professional payroll manager. They forgot that I knew exactly how to track an invoice, how to read a ledger, and most importantly, how to forcefully collect a debt. I turned my back on the glittering window, stepped out into the freezing rain, and began the long walk to my car. I was done being their acceptable sacrifice. It was time to completely dismantle their empire of lies. The agonizing drive from the Montgomery Valley Country Club back to my parents' quiet suburban neighborhood felt like navigating through a heavy, suffocating fog of humiliation. The broken heater in my 10-year-old Toyota was fighting a losing battle against the damp, biting chill that had settled deep into my bones. My mandated beige dress was still plastered to my freezing skin, completely soaked from my unceremonious exile on the loading dock. Every time the worn windshield wipers scraped across the glass, they seemed to mirror the repetitive, agonizing loop playing in my mind. A distant cousin, a girl who does payroll, someone who just loves running errands. Those deeply dismissive words echoed in the small cabin of my car, completely drowning out the sound of the autumn rain pouring against the metal roof. My chest felt totally hollowed out, as if my own family had reached inside and surgically removed every ounce of dignity I possessed. Yet out of sheer foolish habit, I was still doing exactly what they had programmed me to do. My trunk was completely loaded with the leftover bridal shower decorations. The crushed floral centerpieces, the empty luxury gift boxes, and the tangled silk ribbons that my mother had violently shoved into my arms before I fled the venue. I had been strictly instructed to drop them off at their house, so the living room would be perfectly ready for Chloe to sort through her expensive new presents. Even after being publicly disowned and treated like absolute garbage in front of the local elite, the obedient, practical daughter in me was still blindly following orders. I pulled into their wide, smoothly paved driveway. The rain was coming down in relentless, freezing sheets, now pooling around my cheap shoes as I stepped out into the storm. The house was completely dark from the front, a picture-perfect manicured facade, hiding the ugly reality of the people inside. I opened my trunk and hauled out the two heaviest boxes, stacking them awkwardly against my chest. The wet cardboard immediately began to sag against my arms. My plan was remarkably simple. I would leave the damp boxes inside the back mudroom, return to my car, and drive back to my tiny, quiet apartment where I could finally allow myself to completely fall apart. I wanted to crawl into my bed, pull the blankets over my head, and cry until there was absolutely nothing left to shed. I navigated around the side of the house, my low heels sinking deeply into the muddy grass. The security sensor light above the back deck clicked on, casting a harsh, blinding glare over the wooden stairs. As I carefully climbed the slippery steps, balancing the bulky decorations against my hip, I noticed something highly unusual. The heavy glass sliding door that led from the patio into the kitchen was cracked open about 2 inches. A sliver of warm, buttery light spilled out onto the wet wood. It was incredibly strange. My father was famously obsessed with the thermostat and never left doors open, especially not during a freezing autumn downpour. I shifted the boxes in my arms, intending to bump the door open with my shoulder, drop the garbage inside, and quietly slip back out into the night. I assumed they were either exhausted from the afternoon or busy unpacking Chloe's mountain of designer gifts in the front room. I reached the threshold and leaned my weight against the glass. Before the door could slide open, even another fraction of an inch, a sharp, distinct sound stopped me dead in my tracks. Pop! It was the unmistakable, festive sound of a heavy champagne cork being fired from a bottle. I froze the cardboard boxes, suddenly feeling like blocks of lead pressing against my chest. Through the narrow opening of the sliding door, I could hear the immediate, joyful bubbling of expensive liquid pouring into crystal flutes. Then came the laughter. It was not the tired, stressed-out sighs of a family drowning in medical debt and facing imminent foreclosure. It was a loud chorus of bright, triumphant, carefree celebration. I held my breath, terrified that even the sound of my shivering would give me away. I peered through the narrow crack in the glass, keeping my body hidden in the dark, rainy shadows of the deck. My mother, my father, and Chloe were gathered around the expansive granite kitchen island. They had changed out of their stiff country club attire and were wearing plush-matching cashmere loungewear. My father was holding a green bottle of vintage champagne, pouring generous servings for my mother and my sister. The warm pendant lighting caught the shimmering liquid as they all raised their glasses into the air. I pressed my ear closer to the opening, the freezing rain continuing to soak through my thin coat and seep into my shoes. I expected to hear a toast to a successful bridal shower, or perhaps a massive sigh of relief that they had survived an afternoon mingling with the intimidating Patricia Montgomery. Instead, my father raised his glass high, a massive, genuine smile stretching across his face. To the Florida lake boat, he announced, his voice ringing with pure, unadulterated excitement. The deed officially cleared the bank this morning. We are officially the owners of a 28-foot luxury cruiser down in Tampa. My mother and Chloe clinked their glasses against his, cheering loudly and taking long sips of their drinks. I stood on the patio, the rain dripping from my eyelashes, completely unable to process the words I was hearing. A boat. A 28-foot luxury cruiser in Florida. Just 3 days ago, this exact same man had sat at his formal dining room table with his face buried in his hands, claiming that hidden medical bills were destroying their lives. He had literally begged me for $45,000, swearing on his life that it was the only way to save his home from being repossessed by the bank. And now he was celebrating the purchase of a recreational yacht. My father took another sip of his champagne, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. He chuckled, a deep, highly satisfied sound that made my stomach violently churn. Thank God Sarah is so incredibly desperate for our approval, he said, leaning comfortably against the marble counter. If she had not written that massive check on Tuesday, we would have had to dip into our own offshore savings to pay for this ridiculous country club wedding. I was not entirely sure my heart was still beating. I felt completely detached from my physical body, floating somewhere in the dark, icy air above the patio. He had just admitted it with a smile on his face. They were never broke. They were never losing the house. The crushing medical debt was a complete fabrication, a perfectly constructed lie, designed specifically to extract my life savings. They knew I had been hoarding away every single penny for a down payment on my own home, and they decided they would rather steal my future than spend their own hidden wealth on Chloe's extravagant wedding demands. They had literally banked on my deep-seated familial loyalty, twisting my love into a weapon to rob me blind. Chloe giggled, taking a delicate sip from her crystal flute. She leaned over the island, swirling the bubbles in her glass. I still cannot believe she actually handed over the entire $45,000, she said, shaking her head as if marveling at my utter stupidity. I thought she was going to put up a massive fight when I gave her the rule list today. But she just folded. She always folds. It is honestly pathetic how much she wants to be part of the inner circle. My mother Susan let out a harsh, dismissive scoff. She set her glass down and began arranging a plate of imported cheeses. She told Chloe not to waste any pity on me. She said I was used to being entirely alone anyway. I do not even feel bad about sticking her at table 12. Susan stated, her tone dripping with absolute contempt. She belongs by the kitchen doors. Putting her in the back corner keeps Patricia from asking uncomfortable questions about my dowdy, penny-pinching daughter. Could you imagine the absolute embarrassment of introducing a payroll clerk to a state senator during the formal family portraits? It would ruin the entire social dynamic we have worked so hard to build. Chloe nodded in vigorous agreement, grabbing a piece of cheese from the platter. She added that Patricia was already suspicious enough of our family's financial background, and that having my cheap, outdated beige dress ruining the visual aesthetic of the head table would have been a complete disaster. She said telling Patricia I was just a distant cousin who liked to run errands was the smartest thing she had done all day. It completely neutralized the threat of anyone realizing I was actually related to them. Susan praised Chloe's quick thinking. She said it was brilliant damage control. She raised her glass again, proposing a second toast. To my beautiful daughter, she proclaimed, looking warmly at Chloe. You are securing our family's legacy. And to Sarah's checkbook for making sure we did not have to sacrifice our Florida winters to make it happen. The three of them laughed again, a cruel echoing sound that completely shattered whatever fragile remnants of a daughter I had left inside my soul. I stood in the freezing rain, my hands gripping the damp, deteriorating cardboard boxes. I had spent 32 years trying to earn a seat at a table that was never meant for me. I had driven a rusted car, eaten cheap food, and worn outdated clothes just so I could build a financial safety net to rescue these people when they claimed they were drowning. They were not drowning. They were floating on a luxury yacht, laughing as they purposefully held my head underwater. A normal person would have thrown the heavy boxes straight through the glass door. A normal person would have stormed into that warm, bright kitchen, screaming and crying, demanding their $45,000 back. They would have wept over the utter betrayal. They would have begged for an explanation. But as I stood there in the absolute dark, listening to my family toast to my financial ruin, a strange and incredibly powerful transformation occurred. The tears that had been threatening to spill over my eyelids simply stopped. The tight, agonizing knot of sorrow in my chest evaporated entirely, replaced by a sudden, terrifying emptiness. And into that empty space rushed something entirely new. It was not sorrow. It was not grief. It was a cold, pure, unadulterated rage. But it was a highly controlled rage. The emotional, desperate daughter who just wanted to be loved died right there on the wet wooden deck. In her place, the analytical, meticulous, ruthlessly precise payroll manager woke up. My brain immediately shifted gears, shutting down the emotional trauma and analyzing the raw data of the situation. They had my money. The elite vendors were booked. The exclusive country club contracts were signed. But as my mind raced through the logistics of the past 3 weeks, I realized they had made one catastrophic, fatal miscalculation. Because they considered administrative work to be beneath them, they had forced me to handle all the tedious paperwork. I slowly backed away from the sliding glass door. I did not make a single sound. I carried the heavy, soggy boxes of decorations back down the slippery wooden stairs and silently placed them back into the trunk of my beat-up car. I slid into the driver's seat, my wet dress freezing against the worn upholstery. I did not turn on the heater. I did not want to feel warm. I wanted to stay exactly this cold. I gripped the steering wheel, my mind already organizing a massive ledger of retribution. They thought I was just a naive, pathetic wallet they could drain and discard in the shadows. They thought my practicality made me a coward. They completely forgot that when you force the boring, invisible accountant to sign all the legal paperwork for your extravagant high society scam, you are handing her the absolute keys to your entire empire. I put the car in drive and slowly pulled away from the curb, leaving their house behind in the pouring rain. I was not going home to cry into my pillow. I was going home to tear every single contract apart, and I was going to burn their perfect wealthy illusions straight to the absolute ground. The drive back to my tiny apartment was a blinding wash of heavy rain and glaring streetlights. I kept the radio off. I needed the absolute silence to hear my own thoughts over the violent rattling of my 10-year-old car engine. When I finally parked in the cracked asphalt lot of my building, I sat behind the steering wheel for a long time. The freezing dampness of my mandated beige dress clung to my skin, serving as a physical reminder of the prison I had just escaped. I climbed the 3 flights of concrete stairs to my floor, unlocked my door, and stepped into my cramped living room. I flicked on the single overhead light. The space was incredibly small. The linoleum in the kitchenette was peeling at the corners, and I could hear the faint rhythmic dripping of the bathroom faucet. This was the home I had settled for. I had denied myself every luxury, every vacation, and every basic comfort so I could carefully build a savings account. I had done it all so that my sister could sip expensive champagne, and my parents could laugh about my pathetic existence on the deck of their hidden luxury boat. I walked directly into the bathroom and peeled the wet, humiliating dress off my shivering body. I threw it straight into the garbage can. I would never wear beige again. I put on a pair of dry sweatpants and an oversized college sweatshirt. The physical cold was finally leaving my bones, replaced by a steady, pulsing heat radiating from the center of my chest. I walked over to the small folding table I used as a home office and opened my laptop. The screen illuminated the dark room, casting a pale glow across my face. I was no longer the tragic, rejected older sister mourning the loss of a family that never truly existed. I was a professional accountant who managed multi-million-dollar payroll accounts every single day. I tracked anomalies for a living. I audited massive corporate discrepancies. And right now, the biggest financial discrepancy of my entire life was sitting in my personal email inbox. I opened my browser and clicked on the folder simply labeled Wedding. There were over 300 emails inside. For the past 6 months, my mother had forwarded every single vendor correspondence to my email address. I remembered the exact afternoon she started doing it. Susan had called me on a Tuesday, sounding breathless and dramatically overwhelmed. She claimed the immense stress of the impending bank foreclosure was giving her severe heart palpitations. She told me that dealing with the high-end caterers and the snooty venue coordinators was simply too taxing for her fragile nerves. She complained that luxury wedding planners required too much common administrative back and forth. She stated bluntly that she simply did not have the bandwidth for such tedious blue-collar tasks. She told me I was so remarkably good at paperwork, so incredibly organized and practical. She asked me to handle the boring logistics so she could focus entirely on supporting Chloe emotionally through the stressful bridal journey. I had agreed immediately, desperate to relieve my mother of her terrible burden. I opened my banking portal in a separate tab. The reality of my severely depleted savings account glared back at me in harsh black numbers. I began cross-referencing the outgoing bank transfers with the wedding invoices stored in my email. I watched my hard-earned money bleed out across the screen, tracking every single dollar. There was the first venue deposit for the Montgomery Valley Country Club, a staggering $10,000. There was the secondary venue fee, another $5,000 due 30 days before the event. I opened the file for the high-end catering company charging $8,000 for imported Wagyu beef and a premium champagne tower. I found the invoice from the elite florists, billing $6,000 for those towering white orchids I had hauled up the concrete loading dock ramp just hours ago. The numbers climbed higher and higher, meticulously tracking the live classical orchestra, the luxury linen rentals, and the deposit for the 5-tier wedding cake. The total finally hit that devastating $45,000 mark. As I stared at the digital receipts, a sudden electric thought struck me. I clicked back to the email folder and opened the initial PDF contract for the country club. I scrolled quickly past the glossy promotional photos, past the terms and conditions, and past the liability waivers, stopping at the final page of the document. I zoomed in heavily on the electronic signature line at the bottom. The name printed there was not Richard Jenkins. It was not Susan Jenkins. It was not Chloe Jenkins. The signature explicitly and legally read, Sarah Jenkins. My breath hitched in my throat. I quickly opened the catering contract. I bypassed the menu selections and jumped straight to the binding agreement clause. I looked at the signature. Sarah Jenkins. I pulled up the floral agreement. Signed by Sarah Jenkins. I opened the contract for the live orchestra and the luxury rentals. Every single document bore my digital signature, backed by my personal credit card information and my residential billing address. I sat back in my cheap folding chair, the bright light of the laptop screen reflecting in my wide eyes. My heart began to hammer a wild, triumphant rhythm against my ribs. I realized exactly how this incredible legal reality had come to pass. My parents were so deeply consumed by their own arrogance, so utterly obsessed with maintaining their wealthy high society facade, that they viewed the actual mechanics of planning a luxury wedding as completely beneath them. They wanted the glory of the final product without ever getting their hands dirty in the actual process. They viewed signing contracts and tracking payment schedules as peasant work meant for hired help. They were so incredibly eager to shove the administrative labor onto their obedient workhorse daughter that they completely bypassed the legal implications of their profound laziness. They never bothered to read the fine print. They never once realized that by forcing me to act as their unpaid secretary and financial sponsor, they had inadvertently surrendered every ounce of legal control they had over the event. In my line of work, the law is incredibly rigid regarding financial ownership. In payroll, if your name is on the tax documents, the money belongs to you. In contract law, if your name is on the master service agreement, the event belongs to you. I was not just the financial sponsor of this wedding. In the eyes of the law, the Montgomery Valley Country Club did not have a contract with Richard and Susan Jenkins. The country club had a legally binding agreement exclusively with me. The vendors did not answer to my mother or my sister. They answered strictly to the name on the dotted line. If my mother tried to call the caterer tomorrow morning to change the dinner menu, they would refuse to speak to her because she was not the primary account holder. I was the only person with the legal authority to authorize changes, approve final details, or access the venue spaces. I needed to be absolutely certain before I made my next move. I opened a new browser window and searched for the state commerce laws regarding private event contracts and financial liability. I read through the dense legal jargon for an hour, carefully tracing the lines of liability and ownership. The law was absolute and indisputable. The person who signs the contract and provides the funding is the sole legal proprietor of the services rendered. I owned the food. I owned the imported flowers. I owned the right to access the grand ballroom. My family had spent the entire evening treating me like an embarrassing stowaway, who was incredibly lucky to even be allowed inside the building. They had shoved me out into a freezing rainstorm because my appearance embarrassed their new social circle. but legally they were nothing more than guests at my $45,000 private party. I stared at the bright white screen of my laptop, feeling a profound earth-shattering shift in the absolute balance of power. For 32 years, my parents had entirely controlled the narrative of my life. They had dictated my worth, assigning me the permanent role of the quiet, invisible provider who existed only to absorb their stress and fund their extravagant desires. They had successfully orchestrated a massive financial scam, draining my life savings by playing on my deepest childhood fears of losing my home. They thought they had executed the perfect crime. They had their secret luxury boat in Florida. Chloe had her elite Montgomery wedding, and they had successfully hidden the dowdy older sister away so she would not ruin the visual perfection of their high society photographs. I stood up from the folding table and walked over to the small window in my kitchen. The rain was still falling heavily over the darkened parking lot of my apartment complex. Just a few hours ago, I had been standing in an alleyway, freezing and utterly broken, believing that I had lost absolutely everything that mattered to me. I had believed I was trapped in a terrifying financial nightmare bound by non-refundable deposits and suffocating familial obligation. But the truth was staring me right in the face from the glowing screen of my computer. I was not trapped at all. My parents had built an incredibly fragile house of cards completely sustained by my money and my signature, and they had willingly handed me the only match. The sheer magnitude of their stupidity almost made me laugh out loud in the empty apartment. If they had simply paid for the wedding with their own hidden money, they would have gotten away with their cruel treatment of me. If they had just bothered to sign their own names on the venue contracts while using my money to pay the balances, they would have retained complete legal authority over the entire event. I would have had absolutely no recourse, but their overwhelming snobbery was their ultimate downfall. They believed I was too docile to ever read the fine print. They assumed the obedient sister would never dare question the established order of the family dynamics. They thought I was just a walking wallet with no backbone. They completely forgot that a dedicated payroll manager fundamentally understands that whoever controls the financial ledger completely controls the entire company. I walked back to my laptop and rested my hands lightly on the keyboard. I felt an incredible sense of clarity wash over my mind. The path forward was brightly illuminated. Legally, this was not Chloe's wedding. It was not a celebration of the Jenkins and Montgomery union. It was not a high society gathering meant to elevate my family's status in the local community. Legally, Sarah Jenkins was the sole owner and host of a $45,000 private event scheduled for this coming Saturday at the Montgomery Valley Country Club. I owned every single chair, every crystal flute, and every minute of the scheduled timeline. The massive event was entirely mine to do with exactly as I pleased, and I was going to make absolutely certain that the guest of honor was not going to be my sister. I cracked my knuckles and opened a new email draft, ready to initiate the total destruction of their perfect weekend. The pale gray light of an Ohio morning finally crept through the cheap plastic blinds of my apartment. I had not slept a single second. My eyes burned from staring at the glowing laptop screen for 9 straight hours, but my mind was operating with a lethal, razor-sharp clarity. I had spent the entire night tracking every single digital signature, every emailed invoice, and every credit card receipt related to the spectacular high society wedding I had been manipulated into funding. I possessed the entire paper trail, but I needed absolute professional confirmation before I pulled the trigger on my plan. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, I picked up my phone and dialed the number of an old college friend named David. David was a ruthlessly effective civil litigation attorney who practiced at a prestigious firm downtown. He was the kind of lawyer who dismantled complex corporate contracts and destroyed arrogant businessmen for a living. I knew he was exactly the person I needed to validate the massive legal loophole my parents had unknowingly handed to me on a silver platter. David answered on the second ring, sounding surprised to hear from me so early. I did not waste any time with pleasantries. I told him I needed his professional eyes on a stack of vendor contracts immediately, and I asked if I could send them over his secure portal. He agreed, sensing the urgent, unyielding tone in my voice. I compiled the master service agreement from the Montgomery Valley Country Club, the binding contract from the elite luxury catering company, and the specialized imported floral agreements. I attached them all to a single email and hit send. I sat at my kitchen table drinking a cup of bitter black coffee, waiting for him to read through the documents. Those 20 minutes felt like an eternity. I paced across the worn linoleum floor, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I knew what the documents said, but the terrified, conditioned daughter inside of me kept whispering that my parents would somehow find a way to win. They always won. Finally, my phone rang. I answered it immediately. David let out a long, heavy whistle through the receiver. He asked me to confirm exactly what I had just sent him. I explained the entire situation from start to finish. I told him about the tearful intervention where my parents claimed they were facing imminent foreclosure. I told him about the $45,000 check I had written from my house savings. I explained how they had forced me to handle all the tedious administrative paperwork because they viewed interacting with service vendors as peasant work. I told him about the humiliating list of 6 conditions: my banishment to the loading dock in the freezing rain, and the devastating champagne toast where my father celebrated buying a luxury boat with his hidden wealth. David was completely silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was laced with a mixture of profound disgust for my family and absolute professional awe at their sheer stupidity. He told me that my parents had committed a fatal error. He stated that in their arrogant rush to avoid doing any actual work, they had completely surrendered all legal authority over the event. David explained the situation with clinical precision. He said the Montgomery Valley Country Club did not have an agreement with Richard or Susan Jenkins. The prestigious catering company had 0 legal obligations to my sister Chloe. He told me that my name, Sarah Jenkins, was the sole signature on every single dotted line. My personal billing address was listed as the primary contact. My credit card was attached to the holding fees. The verdict he delivered was beautifully ironclad. David told me that from a strictly legal standpoint, this was not a wedding celebration for Chloe Jenkins and Brad Montgomery. Legally, I was the sole proprietor, the absolute owner, and the exclusive host of a $45,000 private event. He assured me that my parents had no legal standing to access the venue, alter the menu, or even step foot on the property without my explicit written consent. I closed my eyes, letting a massive wave of relief wash over my exhausted body. I asked David what my next step should be. I told him I wanted to cancel everything immediately. I wanted to pull the plug, take my money back, and leave them scrambling to explain to the wealthy Montgomery family why the grand ballroom was completely empty. But David quickly stopped me. His tone shifted, becoming cautionary and serious. He told me to look closely at Section 4, Paragraph 2 of the Master Venue Agreement. I opened the PDF on my screen and scrolled down to the dense legal text. David explained that the cancellation policy was absolutely brutal. Because we were now less than a week away from the scheduled event date, the contracts locked me into severe financial penalties. If I canceled the event outright, the country club and the luxury caterer were legally entitled to retain 60% of the total cost as non-refundable liquidated damages. I stared at the screen, a cold pit of dread forming in my stomach. I quickly did the math in my head. If I simply canceled the wedding to spite my family, I would instantly forfeit over $27,000. That money would vanish into thin air. I would be walking away with less than half of my life savings, while my parents would still be sitting comfortably on their secret Florida yacht. David gently told me that canceling would be a massive financial defeat. He warned me that if I lost that much money, my mother would completely spin the narrative. She would paint me as a bitter, unstable, jealous older sister who threw away her own life savings just to ruin her younger sister's special day. The Montgomery family would pity Chloe, and my parents would emerge as the tragic victims of my supposed cruelty. I refused to let that happen. I absolutely refused to be the victim in their twisted story, and I firmly refused to lose the money I had sacrificed my entire youth to save. I thanked David for his time, ended the call, and sat in the absolute quiet of my apartment. I stared at the printed list of 6 conditions my mother had given me. She had explicitly mandated that I sit near the kitchen doors because I did not fit her high society aesthetic. She had ordered me to leave before the photos were taken, so I would not ruin their wealthy legacy. She viewed the event as a grand stage to elevate her social status. A sudden brilliant spark of inspiration ignited in my mind. If I was the sole legal owner of this massive event, and if canceling it meant losing my money, then the solution was incredibly simple. The event was still going to happen. The venue was booked. The 5-star food was ordered. The imported flowers were already arranged. The orchestra was paid. But I had the absolute right to decide who walked through those grand mahogany doors. I picked up my phone and searched for the direct contact number of the general manager at the Montgomery Valley Country Club. I found the listing for a man named Robert Vance. I dialed the number requesting an urgent in-person meeting regarding the Jenkins private event scheduled for that coming Saturday. The receptionist noted the serious tone in my voice and told me that Mr. Vance could see me at 11 o'clock that morning. I showered, washed the temporary dull brown dye out of my hair, so my natural vibrant auburn color returned, and put on the sharpest tailored business suit I owned. I did not look like a distant cousin who ran errands. I looked like a financial executive preparing for a hostile takeover. When I arrived at the sprawling manicured estate of the country club, I bypassed the service entrance completely. I walked straight through the grand front lobby, my heels clicking confidently against the imported marble floors. I was escorted into a luxurious office overlooking the 18th hole of the golf course. Robert Vance was a distinguished, impeccably dressed man in his late 50s. He stood up and offered a polite professional handshake. He gestured for me to sit in a plush leather chair across from his wide mahogany desk. He looked slightly confused, noting that he usually dealt with Susan or Chloe regarding the intricate details of the event. I did not waste any time. I opened my briefcase, pulled out the master contract, and placed it on his desk. I pointed directly to my signature. I politely informed him that while my mother and sister had been the ones touring the ballroom and tasting the cake, I was the sole financial and legal proprietor of the reservation. I told him that I needed to make a massive fundamental change to the event, and I needed to ensure that my legal rights as the contract holder would be absolutely respected. Robert leaned forward, his professional curiosity visibly piqued. He assured me that as the sole signatory, my directive superseded any requests made by other family members. He asked me how he could assist me. I took a deep breath and laid out the entire truth. I did not cry and I did not act hysterical. I spoke with the calm, devastating precision of an auditor presenting evidence of grand larceny. I told him exactly how my parents had faked a financial crisis to drain my life savings. I described the humiliating list of conditions they had handed me. I told him about being banished to the loading dock in the freezing rain while they mingled with the elite guests inside his very own clubhouse. Finally, I told him about the champagne toast I had overheard where they celebrated stealing my money to protect their secret offshore wealth. Robert sat perfectly still, his eyes widening with genuine shock and profound disgust. In his decades of managing luxury country club events, he had certainly dealt with entitled bridezillas and demanding parents, but the sheer calculated cruelty of my family clearly appalled him. He let out a heavy sigh, removing his reading glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. He confessed to me that my mother and sister had been an absolute nightmare for his staff over the past 3 months. He revealed that Susan had repeatedly berated the waitstaff, threatened to have the valet drivers fired over trivial matters, and treated the floral designers like indentured servants. He said his entire team had been dreading the upcoming Saturday event. I smiled a sharp, cold expression. I told him that his staff would not have to deal with Susan or Chloe ever again. I leaned forward and unveiled my masterstroke. I told Robert that I refused to cancel the event and forfeit the massive deposits. Instead, I was exercising my contractual right to alter the nature of the reservation and fundamentally change the guest list. I informed him that there would be no wedding ceremony on the country club lawn. There would be no high society reception for the Montgomery family. I was legally rebranding the entire $45,000 reservation. I was officially transferring the event to the Hope Haven Women and Children's Shelter, a local domestic violence organization that provided safe housing and resources for families escaping abusive situations. The luxury ballroom, the 5-tier cake, the imported white orchids, the live classical orchestra, and the 5-star catering were no longer meant to impress a wealthy local dynasty. It was now a fully funded, entirely private charity gala dedicated exclusively to the survivors living at the shelter. Robert stared at me in absolute stunned silence for several seconds. Then a massive, genuine smile broke across his face. It was the smile of a man who was thrilled to witness justice being served on his own property. He immediately reached for his desk phone and called the head catering chef and the lead event coordinator into his office. When the chef and this coordinator arrived, Robert asked me to repeat my plan. As I explained the pivot from a toxic entitled wedding to a luxury charity gala for battered women and children, the atmosphere in the room transformed into sheer electricity. The chef, who had previously been berated by my sister over the specific temperature of her imported Wagyu beef, actually clapped his hands together. He declared that he was going to personally upgrade the dessert menu at no additional charge, entirely out of respect for the new guests. The event coordinator, a young woman who had been driven to tears by my mother just a week prior, eagerly pulled out her tablet to begin adjusting the ballroom layout. We spent the next 2 hours amending every single document. We removed the bridal arch and replaced it with a beautiful stage for guest speakers from the charity. We changed the seating chart, officially deleting the names of every single local politician, corporate executive, and member of the Montgomery and Jenkins families. We drafted a strict security protocol authorizing the country club guards to deny entry to anyone who was not on the newly approved charity guest list. Robert personally drafted a legal addendum to the master contract, completely locking in the changes. He included a specific ironclad clause stating that neither Susan Jenkins, Richard Jenkins, nor Chloe Jenkins had any authority to alter, cancel, or access the event space. I signed the addendums with a steady hand. My signature effectively killed the high society wedding and officially breathed life into the most spectacular charity gala the town would ever see. Before I left the office, Robert stood up and shook my hand firmly. He promised me that his staff would deliver an absolutely flawless evening for the women and children from the shelter. He assured me that the country club security team would be fully briefed and ready to handle any potential disruptions from unauthorized individuals attempting to enter the premises on Saturday. I walked out of the Montgomery Valley Country Club and back to my car. The heavy, suffocating weight that had rested on my shoulders for the past 7 years was completely gone. I was no longer the practical, invisible workhorse trapped in a cycle of endless sacrifice. I had taken the chains my family used to bind me and forged them into a weapon of absolute destruction. The trap was now perfectly legally set. My parents and my sister were happily living in their delusion, eagerly counting down the hours until they could parade their false wealth in front of the local elite. They believed they held all the power. They believed I was quietly dying of humiliation in the background. But they had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath their feet had already vanished. I just needed to maintain the illusion of compliance for a few more days to ensure the devastation would be swift, public, and entirely inescapable. The pale gray light of an Ohio morning finally crept through the cheap plastic blinds of my apartment. I had not slept a single second. My eyes burned from staring at the glowing laptop screen for 9 straight hours, but my mind was operating with a lethal, razor-sharp clarity. I had spent the entire night tracking every single digital signature, every emailed invoice, and every credit card receipt related to the spectacular high society wedding I had been manipulated into funding. I possessed the entire paper trail, but I needed absolute professional confirmation before I pulled the trigger on my plan. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, I picked up my phone and dialed the number of an old college friend named David. David was a ruthlessly effective civil litigation attorney who practiced at a prestigious firm downtown. He was the kind of lawyer who dismantled complex corporate contracts and destroyed arrogant businessmen for a living. I knew he was exactly the person I needed to validate the massive legal loophole my parents had unknowingly handed to me on a silver platter. David answered on the second ring, sounding surprised to hear from me so early. I did not waste any time with pleasantries. I told him I needed his professional eyes on a stack of vendor contracts immediately, and I asked if I could send them over his secure portal. He agreed, sensing the urgent, unyielding tone in my voice. I compiled the master service agreement from the Montgomery Valley Country Club, the binding contract from the elite luxury catering company, and the specialized imported floral agreements. I attached them all to a single email and hit send. I sat at my kitchen table drinking a cup of bitter black coffee, waiting for him to read through the documents. Those 20 minutes felt like an eternity. I paced across the worn linoleum floor, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I knew what the document said, but the terrified, conditioned daughter inside of me kept whispering that my parents would somehow find a way to win. They always won. Finally, my phone rang. I answered it immediately. David let out a long, heavy whistle through the receiver. He asked me to confirm exactly what I had just sent him. I explained the entire situation from start to finish. I told him about the tearful intervention where my parents claimed they were facing imminent foreclosure. I told him about the $45,000 check I had written from my house savings. I explained how they had forced me to handle all the tedious administrative paperwork because they viewed interacting with service vendors as peasant work. I told him about the humiliating list of 6 conditions: my banishment to the loading dock in the freezing rain and the devastating champagne toast where my father celebrated buying a luxury boat with his hidden wealth. David was completely silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was laced with a mixture of profound disgust for my family and absolute professional awe at their sheer stupidity. He told me that my parents had committed a fatal error. He stated that in their arrogant rush to avoid doing any actual work, they had completely surrendered all legal authority over the event. David explained the situation with clinical precision. He said the Montgomery Valley Country Club did not have an agreement with Richard or Susan Jenkins. The prestigious catering company had 0 legal obligations to my sister Chloe. He told me that my name, Sarah Jenkins, was the sole signature on every single dotted line. My personal billing address was listed as the primary contact. My credit card was attached to the holding fees. The verdict he delivered was beautifully ironclad. David told me that from a strictly legal standpoint, this was not a wedding celebration for Chloe Jenkins and Brad Montgomery. Legally, I was the sole proprietor, the absolute owner, and the exclusive host of a $45,000 private event. He assured me that my parents had no legal standing to access the venue, alter the menu, or even step foot on the property without my explicit written consent. I closed my eyes, letting a massive wave of relief wash over my exhausted body. I asked David what my next steps should be. I told him I wanted to cancel everything immediately. I wanted to pull the plug, take my money back, and leave them scrambling to explain to the wealthy Montgomery family why the grand ballroom was completely empty. But David quickly stopped me. His tone shifted, becoming cautionary and serious. He told me to look closely at Section 4, Paragraph 2 of the Master Venue Agreement. I opened the PDF on my screen and scrolled down to the dense legal text. David explained that the cancellation policy was absolutely brutal. Because we were now less than a week away from the scheduled event date, the contracts locked me into severe financial penalties. If I canceled the event outright, the country club and the luxury caterer were legally entitled to retain 60% of the total cost as non-refundable liquidated damages. I stared at the screen, a cold pit of dread forming in my stomach. I quickly did the math in my head. If I simply canceled the wedding to spite my family, I would instantly forfeit over $27,000. That money would vanish into thin air. I would be walking away with less than half of my life savings, while my parents would still be sitting comfortably on their secret Florida yacht. David gently told me that canceling would be a massive financial defeat. He warned me that if I lost that much money, my mother would completely spin the narrative. She would paint me as a bitter, unstable, jealous older sister who threw away her own life savings just to ruin her younger sister's special day. The Montgomery family would pity Chloe, and my parents would emerge as the tragic victims of my supposed cruelty. I refused to let that happen. I absolutely refused to be the victim in their twisted story, and I firmly refused to lose the money I had sacrificed my entire youth to save. I thanked David for his time, ended the call, and sat in the absolute quiet of my apartment. I stared at the printed list of 6 conditions my mother had given me. She had explicitly mandated that I sit near the kitchen doors because I did not fit her high society aesthetic. She had ordered me to leave before the photos were taken, so I would not ruin their wealthy legacy. She viewed the event as a grand stage to elevate her social status. A sudden brilliant spark of inspiration ignited in my mind. If I was the sole legal owner of this massive event, and if canceling it meant losing my money, then the solution was incredibly simple. The event was still going to happen. The venue was booked. The 5-star food was ordered. The imported flowers were already arranged. The orchestra was paid. But I had the absolute right to decide who walked through those grand mahogany doors. I picked up my phone and searched for the direct contact number of the general manager at the Montgomery Valley Country Club. I found the listing for a man named Robert. I dialed the number requesting an urgent in-person meeting regarding the Jenkins private event scheduled for that coming Saturday. The receptionist noted the serious tone in my voice and told me that Robert could see me at 11 o'clock that morning. I washed the temporary dull brown dye out of my hair, so my natural, vibrant auburn color returned, and put on the sharpest tailored business suit I owned. I did not look like a distant cousin who ran errands. I looked like a financial executive preparing for a hostile takeover. When I arrived at the sprawling manicured estate of the country club, I bypassed the service entrance completely. I walked straight through the grand front lobby, my heels clicking confidently against the imported marble floors. I was escorted into a luxurious office overlooking the 18th hole of the golf course. Robert was a distinguished, impeccably dressed man in his late 50s. He stood up and offered a polite professional handshake. He gestured for me to sit in a plush leather chair across from his wide mahogany desk. He looked slightly confused, noting that he usually dealt with Susan or Chloe regarding the intricate details of the event. I did not waste any time. I opened my briefcase, pulled out the master contract, and placed it on his desk. I pointed directly to my signature. I politely informed him that while my mother and sister had been the ones touring the ballroom and tasting the cake, I was the sole financial and legal proprietor of the reservation. I told him that I needed to make a massive fundamental change to the event, and I needed to ensure that my legal rights as the contract holder would be absolutely respected. Robert leaned forward. His professional curiosity visibly piqued. He assured me that as the sole signatory, my directive superseded any requests made by other family members. He asked me how he could assist me. I took a deep breath and laid out the entire truth. I did not cry, and I did not act hysterical. I spoke with the calm, devastating precision of an auditor presenting evidence of grand larceny. I told him exactly how my parents had faked a financial crisis to drain my life savings. I described the humiliating list of conditions they had handed me. I told him about being banished to the loading dock in the freezing rain while they mingled with the elite guests inside his very own clubhouse. Finally, I told him about the champagne toast I had overheard, where they celebrated stealing my money to protect their secret offshore wealth. Robert sat perfectly still, his eyes widening with genuine shock and profound disgust. In his decades of managing luxury country club events, he had certainly dealt with entitled bridezillas and demanding parents, but the sheer calculated cruelty of my family clearly appalled him. He let out a heavy sigh, removing his reading glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. He confessed to me that my mother and sister had been an absolute nightmare for his staff over the past 3 months. He revealed that Susan had repeatedly berated the waitstaff, threatened to have the valet drivers fired over trivial matters, and treated the floral designers like indentured servants. He said his entire team had been dreading the upcoming Saturday event. I smiled a sharp, cold expression. I told him that his staff would not have to deal with Susan or Chloe ever again. I leaned forward and unveiled my masterstroke. I told Robert that I refused to cancel the event and forfeit the massive deposits. Instead, I was exercising my contractual right to alter the nature of the reservation and fundamentally change the guest list. I informed him that there would be no wedding ceremony on the country club lawn. There would be no high society reception for the Montgomery family. I was legally rebranding the entire $45,000 reservation. I was officially transferring the event to the Hope Haven Women and Children Shelter, a local domestic violence organization that provided safe housing and resources for families escaping abusive situations. The luxury ballroom, the 5-tier cake, the imported white orchids, the live classical orchestra, and the 5-star catering were no longer meant to impress a wealthy local dynasty. It was now a fully funded, entirely private charity gala, dedicated exclusively to the survivors living at the shelter. Robert stared at me in absolute stunned silence for several seconds. Then a massive, genuine smile broke across his face. It was the smile of a man who was thrilled to witness justice being served on his own property. He immediately reached for his desk phone and called the head catering chef and the lead event coordinator into his office. When the chef and the coordinator arrived, Robert asked me to repeat my plan. As I explained the pivot from a toxic entitled wedding to a luxury charity gala for battered women and children, the atmosphere in the room transformed into sheer electricity. The chef, who had previously been berated by my sister over the specific temperature of her imported Wagyu beef, actually clapped his hands together. He declared that he was going to personally upgrade the dessert menu at no additional charge, entirely out of respect for the new guests. The event coordinator, a young woman who had been driven to tears by my mother just a week prior, eagerly pulled out her tablet to begin adjusting the ballroom layout. We spent the next 2 hours amending every single document. We removed the bridal arch and replaced it with a beautiful stage for guest speakers from the charity. We changed the seating chart, officially deleting the names of every single local politician, corporate executive, and member of the Montgomery and Jenkins families. We drafted a strict security protocol authorizing the country club guards to deny entry to anyone who was not on the newly approved charity guest list. Robert personally drafted a legal addendum to the master contract, completely locking in the changes. He included a specific ironclad clause stating that neither Susan Jenkins, Richard Jenkins, nor Chloe Jenkins had any authority to alter, cancel, or access the event space. I signed the addendums with a steady hand. My signature effectively killed the high society wedding and officially breathed life into the most spectacular charity gala the town would ever see. Before I left the office, Robert stood up and shook my hand firmly. He promised me that his staff would deliver an absolutely flawless evening for the women and children from the shelter. He assured me that the country club security team would be fully briefed and ready to handle any potential disruptions from unauthorized individuals attempting to enter the premises on Saturday. I walked out of the Montgomery Valley Country Club and back to my car. The heavy, suffocating weight that had rested on my shoulders for the past 7 years was completely gone. I was no longer the practical, invisible workhorse trapped in a cycle of endless sacrifice. I had taken the chains my family used to bind me and forged them into a weapon of absolute destruction. The trap was now perfectly legally set. My parents and my sister were happily living in their delusion, eagerly counting down the hours until they could parade their false wealth in front of the local elite. They believed they held all the power. They believed I was quietly dying of humiliation in the background. But they had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath their feet had already vanished. I just needed to maintain the illusion of compliance for a few more days to ensure the devastation would be swift, public, and entirely inescapable. Thursday evening settled over my small apartment with a profound and unfamiliar stillness. For the past 6 months, my living space had been a frantic command center of bridal logistics, constantly cluttered with imported fabric swatches, embossed seating charts, and endless catering menus. But tonight my scratched linoleum dining table was completely bare, swept clean of everything except a few carefully selected items resting under the warm yellow glow of a single overhead lamp. I stood in the center of the room, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock, feeling a deep sense of absolute control. I was no longer the obedient, panicked daughter scrambling to save her family from a fabricated financial ruin. I was a seasoned payroll manager meticulously balancing a ledger that had been in the red for over 3 decades. I walked over to the table and ran my fingertips across the smooth, heavy surface of a stunning black velvet box. I had purchased it earlier that afternoon from an exclusive boutique downtown, spending $100 on the packaging alone. My mother and sister had spent their entire lives obsessing over appearances, endlessly judging the world based on brand names, luxury materials, and high society aesthetics. They worshipped the illusion of wealth. So I decided I would speak to them in the only language they truly understood. The presentation of my final gift had to be absolutely flawless. It had to look exactly like the kind of extravagant wedding present a wealthy, sophisticated guest would deliver to the elite Montgomery family. Inside the velvet box rested a custom-made leather-bound portfolio binder. I opened the thick leather cover, the spine creaking slightly in the quiet room. There were no plastic sheet protectors or cheap dividers inside. Every page was printed on heavy premium watermarked cardstock. This was not a chaotic collection of angry notes. It was a precise chronological and legally devastating dossier of their ultimate betrayal. I picked up the first document and placed it gently as the opening page of the binder. It was a certified notarized copy of a bill of sale and property deed registered in Hillsborough County, Florida. Tracking down their hidden assets had been remarkably easy once I stopped believing their lies and started looking at them like an auditor. A simple public records search had revealed the truth in stark, indisputable black and white. The document detailed the purchase of a 28-foot luxury recreational cruiser complete with a twin-engine upgrade and a premium teakwood deck. I stared at the purchase price highlighted near the bottom of the page. It was finalized just 48 hours after I had handed my father my life savings. They had not used my money to buy the boat. They had used their own hidden offshore funds to secure their sunny winter retirement toy, actively choosing to drain my modest house fund to pay for Chloe's country club spectacle. They had looked at my 10-year-old car, my packed lunches, and my tiny apartment, and decided that my future was entirely expendable as long as they could sail the Gulf Coast in style. Placing that deed into the binder felt like burying the last lingering trace of daughterly guilt I possessed. The paper was undeniable proof that their financial ruin was a magnificent, malicious, theatrical performance. I turned to the second document, smoothing my hand over the crisp edges of the cardstock. This page had been drafted with the direct assistance of my attorney friend David. It carried the full, terrifying weight of state commerce and private property law. It was a formal, legally binding revocation of invitation. The document was addressed to Richard Jenkins, Susan Jenkins, Chloe Jenkins, and the entire extended Montgomery family. The legal phrasing was beautifully rigid and completely devoid of emotion. It explicitly stated that as the sole financial proprietor and legal contract holder of the Saturday evening reservation at the Montgomery Valley Country Club, I was formally revoking their status as authorized guests. The document outlined that the nature of the event had been legally altered and transferred to a private charitable organization. Furthermore, it contained a strict trespassing warning. It notified them that the country club security team had been provided with their names and photographs, and any attempt to access the venue, the grounds, or the parking facilities would result in immediate removal by local law enforcement. I read their names printed in bold black ink. For months they had threatened to exclude me. They had handed me a humiliating list of conditions ordering me to hide by the kitchen doors and leave before the family portraits so my dowdy appearance would not embarrass them in front of their wealthy new friends. They had treated my presence like a stain on their perfect day. Now, with a few carefully drafted legal paragraphs, I was permanently erasing them from the celebration entirely. I was not just banning them from a party, I was legally locking them out of the high society kingdom they had sacrificed my dignity to enter. Next to the leather binder resting in a small black satin jewelry pouch was the third item. I opened the drawstring and tipped a sleek silver USB drive into the palm of my hand. The cold metal felt heavy with the sheer destructive power it contained. When I had fled their house during the freezing rainstorm, I realized my 10-year-old Toyota had been parked on the gravel directly beneath their elevated wooden deck. Last year, after a string of car break-ins at my apartment complex, I had installed a highly sensitive motion-activated dashcam that recorded high-definition audio and video even when the engine was turned off. When I had retreated to my car in the rain, my mind frantically piecing together the betrayal I had just witnessed through the sliding glass door. I had quickly popped the memory card out of the camera. The sensitive microphone had captured the entire patio conversation. It had perfectly recorded the loud, booming pop of the vintage champagne cork. It had caught my father's joyous, booming voice celebrating the clearing of the Florida boat deed. It had meticulously captured my mother's cruel, venomous laughter as she mocked my pathetic desire for their approval and proudly detailed her plan to hide me at table 12. And it had preserved Chloe's smug, entitled voice calling me a practical, easily manipulated workhorse. I had transferred the raw, unedited audio file directly onto the silver USB drive. I did not need to listen to it again. The exact cadence of their mocking laughter was already permanently burned into my memory. But I knew that simply canceling their event would not be enough. My mother was a master manipulator. If she only received a cancellation notice, she would instantly spin a tragic narrative. She would cry to Patricia Montgomery claiming that her older daughter had suffered a severe mental breakdown and maliciously ruined the wedding out of sheer unprovoked jealousy. Susan would paint herself as a weeping martyr. The audio file on this drive completely neutralized any possibility of a victim narrative. There was no way to explain away the sound of their own voices ruthlessly mocking the person who was funding their entire existence. The recording proved they were not victims of a sudden financial crisis or a bitter sister. It proved they were calculating greedy predators who viewed the wealthy Montgomery family as nothing more than a social ladder to climb. I slipped the silver drive back into the satin pouch and gently placed it inside a specialized pocket on the inside cover of the leather binder. Finally, I picked up the last piece of paper. It was not a legal document or a piece of gathered evidence. It was an invoice. I had generated it using the professional accounting software on my laptop, formatting it to look exactly like the high-end corporate billing statements I processed every single day at the logistics firm. The top of the page featured a clean, modern header with my name and contact information. The billed party was listed as Richard, Susan, and Chloe Jenkins. Below that was an itemized breakdown of the funds they had extracted from me. The $10,000 initial venue deposit, the $8,000 catering fee, the $6,000 for the imported white orchids. The line items marched down the page perfectly accounting for every single stolen cent. At the very bottom of the page where the total balance due was normally printed, I had typed a customized message in clear, bold, unyielding text. It read, "Event ownership successfully transferred to the Hope Haven Charity Organization. Total cost of your high society lesson in fundamental respect, $45,000. Balance paid in full. Account permanently closed." I stared at those words for a very long time. Account permanently closed. It was more than just a financial statement. It was the absolute end of my childhood desperation. It was the termination of my lifelong campaign to earn the love of people who were fundamentally incapable of giving it. I was closing the ledger on my entire family. I placed the invoice on the very top of the stack inside the leather binder. I wanted it to be the absolute first thing they saw when they opened the heavy cover. I wanted the cold, hard number to hit them right between the eyes before they even processed the legal revocation or the Florida boat deed. I closed the thick leather cover of the portfolio. I placed it gently into the bottom of the black velvet box. The fit was absolutely perfect, snug, and secure. I placed the lid over the box, pressing it down until it formed a seamless, elegant block of dark velvet. I reached for a spool of wide champagne-colored silk ribbon I had purchased to match the Montgomery wedding aesthetic perfectly. I wrapped the shimmering ribbon around the velvet box, pulling it tight, and tying it into an immaculate, flawless bow on the very top. The finished product looked incredibly expensive, deeply sophisticated, and completely harmless. It looked exactly like a generous, high-end gift from a wealthy benefactor. It looked like a token of love. I stood back and admired the box sitting under the warm light of my apartment. My hands were no longer shaking. The crushing, suffocating anxiety that had plagued me for the past week was completely eradicated. I felt light, focused, and dangerously calm. Tomorrow night was the rehearsal dinner. My parents and Chloe were currently preparing to dine at a five-star downtown restaurant with Brad, Patricia, and the entire elite Montgomery clan. They were likely planning to spend the evening bragging about the lavish country club event scheduled for the following afternoon. They probably thought I was currently rushing around the city picking up last-minute vendor supplies and silently suffering under the weight of their 6 humiliating conditions. They had no idea that I was standing in my quiet, safe apartment, looking at the exact instrument of their impending destruction. They had no idea that their perfect, carefully constructed high society illusion had a massive ticking time bomb waiting to be delivered straight to their dinner table. I gently picked up the velvet box, feeling the solid, satisfying weight of the evidence inside. I carried it over to the small table by my front door and set it down next to my car keys. I did not feel any guilt. I did not feel any lingering hesitation. I had spent 32 years pouring my heart, my energy, and my finances into a bottomless pit of familial manipulation. I had played the role of the quiet, practical workhorse perfectly. But my shift was finally over. The final gift was fully packaged, the legal traps were perfectly set, and I was absolutely ready to watch them open the box and realize that the quiet, invisible daughter had just burned their entire empire to the ground. I turned off the living room light, walked into my bedroom, and for the first time in an entire week, I slept completely and perfectly soundly. The cool, crisp air of Friday evening settled over the city, carrying with it the unmistakable hum of impending weekend celebrations. Tonight was the apex of my family's carefully constructed social climb. The extravagant rehearsal dinner was being held at Le Grand Coeur, the most formidable and exclusive French restaurant in the entire metropolitan area. The Montgomery family had spared absolutely no expense renting out the magnificent private dining suite enclosed by heavy mahogany doors and soundproof glass. I was not in attendance. I had sent a text message to my mother at 4 o'clock that afternoon, crafting a masterful illusion of subservient compliance. I apologized profusely for my absence, claiming I was stuck in severe gridlock driving across the state line to pick up the specialized imported linen napkins she had demanded for the reception. I promised her that I was diligently fulfilling condition number 5 of their rules, assuring her that I would remain completely out of sight and entirely out of the professional photographs. My mother had replied with a simple dismissive thumbs-up emoji, perfectly satisfied that her invisible workhorse was exactly where she belonged. My mother's sense of triumph had been severely inflated earlier that morning during a final audacious financial shakedown. She and Chloe had cornered me via a frantic group phone call. Susan had breathlessly announced that Patricia Montgomery had casually mentioned her absolute expectation of vintage Dom Perignon for the head table toasts. Terrified of looking cheap, my mother demanded that I immediately upgrade the champagne order. She explicitly told me it would cost an additional $3,000. She added a sharp, insulting jab, telling me that since I lived in such a pathetic, inexpensive apartment, I certainly had the disposable income to spare. In my mind, the entire day had played out like a perfectly directed cinematic sequence utilizing a brilliant split screen. On one side of the reality, I was the ultimate compliant, beaten-down sister. I smiled warmly into the phone. I kept my voice incredibly soft and agreeable. I apologized for ever being a burden and promised her that I would handle the $3,000 upgrade immediately so Chloe could have the perfect, luxurious toast she deserved. On the other side of that mental split screen, my hands were moving with ruthless mechanical precision. The very second the call disconnected, I paid the premium directly to the caterer and seamlessly signed the final legal addendum. I officially and irrevocably transferred the vintage Dom Perignon directly to the Hope Haven Charity Gala. I smiled, knowing with absolute certainty that the brave women at the domestic violence shelter were going to be drinking the absolute finest champagne available, funded entirely by my mother's bottomless vanity. Now, instead of driving across the state, I was standing quietly in the shadows of the restaurant's coat check alcove. I had handed the young hostess a crisp $100 bill to let me stand behind the heavy velvet curtains, granting me a perfect unobstructed view of the private dining room through the cracked French doors. I watched the glittering scene unfold. The long dining table was adorned with towering silver candelabras and lush floral arrangements. Patricia Montgomery sat at the head of the table, dripping in flawless diamonds, holding court with the absolute authority of a queen. Chloe sat next to her, wearing a pristine white silk gown, leaning in and laughing enthusiastically at every single word Patricia said. My parents, Richard and Susan, were practically vibrating with smug satisfaction, drinking expensive wine and soaking in the wealthy atmosphere they believed they had finally conquered. At exactly 8 o'clock, right as the main course plates were being cleared by the waitstaff, my hired executioner arrived. I had contracted a professional luxury courier service specifically for this precise moment. The courier was a tall, imposing man dressed in an immaculate uniform with pristine white gloves. He carried the heavy black velvet box tied with the shimmering champagne silk ribbon. He walked past the coat check, offering me a brief professional nod, and marched directly through the mahogany doors into the private dining suite. The lively conversation in the room immediately ceased as the imposing figure approached the head table. The courier stood perfectly straight and announced in a loud, commanding voice that he had a priority, highly confidential delivery regarding the wedding event scheduled for tomorrow. He stated he had strict legal instructions to deliver the package directly into the hands of Susan and Chloe Jenkins, and that the contents required their immediate attention. A collective murmur of excitement rippled through the Montgomery family. Chloe clapped her hands together, a massive smile lighting up her face. She looked at Patricia and loudly assumed that it was an extravagant early wedding gift from a very important guest. Susan puffed out her chest with pride, eagerly reaching forward to accept the stunning velvet box from the courier. The courier bowed slightly, turned on his heel, and briskly exited the restaurant. I held my breath in the shadows, my heart hammering a relentless, deafening rhythm against my ribs. I watched my mother eagerly untie the champagne silk ribbon. She pulled the lid off the velvet box, her eyes wide with greedy anticipation. She reached inside, clearly expecting to pull out heavy silver or expensive jewelry. Instead, her hands grasped the thick, customized leather portfolio binder. She pulled it out and set it on the table. She opened the heavy leather cover. The very first page was the professional invoice I had generated. I watched my mother's eyes scan the bold black text. I watched the exact moment her brain processed the words. Event ownership successfully transferred to the Hope Haven charity organization. Total cost of your lesson in respect $45,000. The warm, flushed color completely drained from Susan Jenkins' face. Her skin turned an alarming shade of chalk white. Her jaw went completely slack, her mouth hanging open in absolute paralyzed horror. Her hands began to tremble violently, causing the heavy cardstock paper to shake against the table. She could not speak. She could not breathe. She just sat there staring at the paper as if it had suddenly burst into flames. Patricia Montgomery, whose entire personality was built upon absolute control and insatiable curiosity, immediately noticed the terrifying shift in my mother's demeanor. Patricia did not ask for permission. She simply reached across the table and snatched the leather binder directly out of Susan's paralyzed hands. Patricia adjusted her reading glasses and looked down at the documents. Patricia had no reason to protect my family's secrets, and she possessed a voice trained to command large rooms. She began reading the documents out loud, her tone echoing clearly throughout the dead-silent dining room. She read the formal, legally binding revocation of invitation. She announced to the entire gathered crowd that Richard, Susan, and Chloe Jenkins were officially stripped of their hosting rights. She read the brutal legal phrasing stating that the event had been transferred to a local domestic violence shelter. She read the ironclad trespassing clause informing the room that Country Club security had been authorized to remove the Jenkins family from the premises using law enforcement if necessary. Chloe let out a sudden high-pitched gasp, gripping the edge of the table. The blood completely vanished from her face, leaving her looking sickly and terrified. She started hyperventilating, shaking her head in violent denial. Richard lunged forward, trying to grab the binder from Patricia, sputtering completely incoherent sentences. But Patricia Montgomery pulled the binder away, her eyes narrowing into dangerous, calculated slits. She turned to the next page. It was the certified copy of the property deed from Hillsborough County, Florida. Patricia read the purchase price and the date out loud. She lowered the binder and stared directly at my father. Her voice turned to absolute freezing ice. She looked at Richard and stated that just last week, he had personally told her husband that the Jenkins family was struggling with unforeseen medical debts. She asked him slowly and deliberately why he was secretly purchasing a luxury twin-engine boat in Florida, while his older daughter was apparently footing the entire bill for this humiliated, canceled wedding. The room erupted into shocked, chaotic whispers. Brad Montgomery, the groom, stood up from his chair. His face was a mask of total confusion and rising anger. He looked at Chloe, demanding to know what was happening and why her sister had legally canceled their wedding. Chloe could only sob, covering her face with her hands, entirely unable to construct a lie fast enough to save herself. Brad reached across the table to look at the binder himself. As he pulled the leather cover toward him, the small black satin pouch slipped out of the interior pocket and landed softly on the white tablecloth. Brad picked it up, loosening the drawstring. He tipped the sleek silver USB drive into the palm of his hand. He looked at the drive, then looked at the sleek silver laptop resting on the presentation table in the corner of the room. The Montgomery family had been using the laptop earlier in the evening to display a sentimental slideshow of childhood photographs. Brad walked over to the laptop. Susan suddenly snapped out of her paralyzed state. She shrieked a desperate animalistic sound and lunged out of her chair, begging Brad not to plug the drive into the computer. She practically crawled across the room, desperate to stop him. But Brad simply held up his hand, signaling her to step back, and firmly pushed the silver drive into the side of the machine. He opened the single audio file displayed on the screen and pressed play. The volume on the presentation speakers was turned up extremely high. The audio quality of the dashcam recording was perfectly, terrifyingly pristine. The entire private dining suite sat in dead, suffocating silence as the sharp, distinct sound of a champagne cork popping echoed out of the speakers. Then came the booming, jovial voice of Richard Jenkins. The audio blasted his exact words across the room. "The deed to the Florida lake boat cleared today. Thank God Sarah is so desperate for our approval. If she had not written that check, we would have had to dip into our own savings for this wedding." I watched Patricia Montgomery flinch as if she had been physically struck across the face. Her husband, a wealthy state senator, crossed his arms, his expression turning absolutely lethal. The recording continued without mercy. Susan's cruel, venomous voice filled the elegant room. She is used to being alone anyway. Putting her at table 12 keeps Patricia from asking questions about my dowdy, penny-pinching daughter. The entire Montgomery family turned to stare at Susan. She was standing in the middle of the room, her hands covering her mouth, shaking uncontrollably as her own voice condemned her in front of the exact people she worshipped. Then came the final, devastating blow. Chloe's bright, giggling voice echoed through the speakers. "She always folds. It is honestly pathetic how much she wants to be part of the inner circle. She is just a practical workhorse." Brad Montgomery stared at the woman he was supposed to marry the next day. The sheer disgust radiating from his eyes was absolute. Chloe reached out for him, tears streaming down her face, begging him to listen to her, claiming it was just a stupid joke taken out of context. Brad simply stepped backward, creating a massive physical distance between them. He shook his head slowly, looking at her, as if he had never actually seen her before. Patricia Montgomery stood up. She did not yell. She did not create a theatrical scene. She possessed the terrifying quiet power of generational wealth. She looked at Richard and Susan Jenkins, her voice completely stripped of any warmth or politeness. She told them they were the most utterly despicable, classless, and fraudulent people she had ever had the extreme misfortune of meeting. She stated clearly that there would be no wedding tomorrow, and there would certainly be no union between their families ever again. Patricia picked up her expensive silver clutch, signaled to her husband and her son, and gracefully walked toward the exit. The entire Montgomery clan stood up in perfect unison, abandoning their half-eaten meals and their expensive wine. They filed out of the private dining room, refusing to even look at my parents as they passed by. In less than 10 minutes, the grand, glittering room had been entirely evacuated of its high society guests. Only Richard, Susan, and Chloe remained. My father was slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the wall. Chloe was sobbing hysterically on the floor, her ruined white silk dress pooling around her. My mother stood completely frozen, staring at the black velvet box resting on the table, finally realizing the true cost of her immense vanity. I stood in the shadows of the coat check alcove, my heart completely calm and my soul entirely light. I did not step forward to gloat. I did not need to deliver a dramatic final speech. The meticulously organized paperwork and their own cruel voices had done absolutely all the talking necessary. I had given them exactly what they wanted. I had fulfilled condition number 5 perfectly. I had remained completely out of sight. I turned around the soft fabric of my coat brushing against the velvet curtains and walked out the front doors of the restaurant into the cool, crisp autumn night. I inhaled a deep breath of fresh air, feeling a profound sense of absolute liberation. The crushing weight of their expectations, the decades of financial manipulation, and the desperate yearning for their approval were entirely gone, left behind in the ruins of a private dining room. I walked to my car, started the engine, and drove away from my past, absolutely ready to embrace the quiet, peaceful future I had finally secured for myself. The drive back from the elegant restaurant was a blur of passing headlights and deep, steady breaths. When I finally unlocked the door and stepped inside my quiet apartment, the silence felt absolutely magnificent. I placed my keys on the small wooden table and walked into the kitchen to pour a cold glass of water. It was then that I noticed the frantic vibrating sound coming from the bottom of my purse. I pulled out my phone and stared at the glowing digital screen. The notification center displayed an astonishing 86 missed calls. There were dozens of frantic attempts from my mother, along with angry dials from my father and a barrage of desperate notifications from Chloe. Before I could even set the device down, the screen illuminated again. It was call number 87. My mother was calling me once more. For my entire adult life, a missed call from my mother would cause a severe spike of anxiety in my chest. I would automatically assume I had done something terribly wrong or failed to anticipate a specific family need. But standing in my kitchen tonight, my pulse remained completely calm. I took a slow sip of my water and pressed the green button to accept the connection. I did not offer a polite greeting. I simply held the phone to my ear and listened to the chaos. The noise that erupted from the speaker was completely unrecognizable as human speech at first. It was a shrill, hysterical shriek followed by the sharp sound of something heavy smashing against a wall. My mother was completely hyperventilating. She was screaming with a level of raw, unhinged fury that I had never witnessed in my entire 32 years of life. She demanded to know exactly what I had done to her. She shrieked that Patricia Montgomery had just stood up and walked out of the rehearsal dinner. She screamed that Brad had looked at Chloe with absolute disgust and officially called off the entire wedding right there in the private dining room. Susan wailed that I had completely ruined my younger sister's life and humiliated the Jenkins family in front of the most important wealthy people in the state. She called me a vindictive, evil monster who deserved to suffer alone. She demanded that I fix the situation immediately. She ordered me to call Patricia Montgomery, beg for forgiveness, and reverse whatever ridiculous legal trick I had pulled with the country club contracts. I let her scream until her voice grew hoarse and ragged. I listened to her desperate, tyrannical commands, feeling entirely detached from the frantic woman on the other end of the line. When she finally paused to gasp for air, I spoke. My voice was eerily calm, completely flat, and devoid of any residual daughterly affection. I told her that I had absolutely nothing to fix. I gently reminded her of the beautiful thick piece of cardstock she had handed me just a few days prior, containing my required behavioral guidelines. I said I was simply following condition number 6 to the absolute letter. I told her that she had specifically mandated I remove myself from the venue before the formal professional photographs were taken to ensure the high society visual aesthetic was not ruined by my dowdy appearance. I explained that I had merely taken my compliance one step further. I had removed myself completely, and I had simply taken my $45,000 private party with me. I did not let her interrupt my explanation. I told her that she and Dad could use their vast financial resources to book a new venue if they were truly desperate to save face. I suggested they dip into the secret offshore accounts they had bragged about during their champagne patio toast. I told my mother to enjoy the new 28-foot luxury twin-engine cruiser in Florida, and I sincerely hoped the warm tropical breeze would provide some comfort while they explained their complete social ruin to the entire neighborhood. Before she could unleash another deafening wave of hysterical shrieking, I pulled the phone away from my ear, ended the call, and permanently blocked her number. I proceeded to block my father and my sister. I opened my social media accounts and severed every digital connection to the Jenkins family. I erased their access to my life with the exact same ruthless efficiency they had used to erase my dignity. The aftermath of the rehearsal dinner massacre unfolded rapidly over the following weeks, sending massive shockwaves through the local community. Patricia Montgomery was not a woman who forgave public humiliation, and she possessed the generational wealth and social influence to completely destroy anyone who crossed her path. The Montgomery family immediately severed all ties with my parents. They did not just quietly cancel the wedding ceremony. Patricia made absolutely certain that every single influential family in the city knew exactly why the union had been dissolved. She openly shared the scandalous details of my parents' predatory financial schemes and their cruel manipulation of their oldest daughter. The high society circle that my mother had spent decades desperately trying to infiltrate suddenly slammed their doors permanently shut. Susan and Richard were officially blacklisted from the Montgomery Valley Country Club. Their pending membership application was formally rejected by the board, and they were barred from attending any future charity galas, holiday luncheons, or golf tournaments. My mother was suddenly ostracized by the wealthy women she had spent months flattering and imitating. When she tried to attend her usual neighborhood committee meetings, she found herself completely isolated and ignored by former friends who were disgusted by the sheer audacity of her greed. The immaculate suburban facade she had maintained for her entire adult life crumbled into dust. She became a social pariah entirely trapped in the very neighborhood she had once ruled with judgment and arrogance. Chloe did not fare any better in the aftermath. Brad Montgomery completely cut all contact with her, moving his belongings out of their shared luxury apartment while she was crying at our parents' house. Without the prestigious Montgomery name attached to her, Chloe suddenly found herself devoid of any real social status. The wealthy bridesmaids, who had happily mocked my auburn hair and my cheap beige dress, quickly distanced themselves from the massive public scandal. Chloe had built her entire identity around the concept of marrying into money, completely neglecting her own education and professional development over the years. Now she was a 30-year-old woman with no career, no fiancé, and a severely tarnished reputation. She was forced to move back into my parents' house, permanently occupying her childhood bedroom, while endlessly mourning the extravagant future she had arrogantly assumed was guaranteed. But the most devastating blow to my family was the swift and brutal financial reckoning. The Montgomery family was incredibly wealthy, but they were also fiercely protective of their personal assets. Patricia's husband, the state senator, deployed his own team of ruthless attorneys to reclaim the money his family had invested in the wedding preparations. The Montgomerys had personally paid over $10,000 for the extravagant rehearsal dinner at the French restaurant, as well as a lavish $15,000 two-week honeymoon package to the Maldives. Since the wedding was canceled due to the explicit recorded fraud committed by the Jenkins family, the Montgomery attorneys legally demanded full and immediate restitution. They threatened to file a massive civil lawsuit for fraud and severe emotional distress if my parents did not reimburse them for the completely wasted expenditures within 14 days. The threat of a highly publicized legal battle completely terrified my father. He knew that if the lawsuit went to a public court, the pristine dashcam audio recording of his cruel champagne toast would become a matter of public record, entirely destroying his professional career as well as his remaining social standing. Faced with the crushing reality of the Montgomery legal team, my parents had absolutely no choice but to liquidate their hidden assets immediately. They could not use my life savings to bail themselves out this time. In a poetic twist of absolute justice, my father was forced to contact the Florida boat dealership and put his precious luxury twin-engine cruiser back on the market just days after the deed had officially cleared. Because they needed the cash instantly to settle the Montgomery debt and avoid a devastating lawsuit, they were forced to accept a catastrophic loss on the rapid resale. They lost tens of thousands of dollars in sudden depreciation and broker fees, completely wiping out the secret offshore savings they had hoarded for their sunny winter retirement. While my family was drowning in the miserable consequences of their own toxic actions, I experienced the most profoundly beautiful evening of my entire life. That Saturday, while my mother and sister were weeping in their darkened suburban house, I stood in the grand ballroom of the Montgomery Valley Country Club. The venue had been entirely transformed into a spectacular haven of joy and dignity. The women and children from the local domestic violence shelter arrived in a fleet of rented vehicles, stepping into a warm world of luxury they had never been allowed to experience before. The country club staff, deeply moved by the sudden meaningful change in the event's purpose, treated every single guest like absolute royalty. The head catering chef personally served the children towering slices of custom chocolate cake. The women, many of whom had escaped terrifying abuse with nothing but the clothes on their backs, were treated to premium catering, imported floral arrangements, and the uplifting music of the live classical orchestra. I did not sit at a small table near the swinging kitchen doors. I sat at the center of the beautiful room, surrounded by courageous survivors who laughed, danced, and celebrated their own incredible resilience. I watched a young mother twirl her laughing daughter on the polished hardwood floor beneath the sparkling crystal chandeliers, and I knew with absolute certainty that parting with my $45,000 was the greatest and most rewarding investment I had ever made in my life. In the months that followed, my life expanded in positive ways I had never thought possible. I was no longer the quiet, invisible payroll clerk carrying the crushing emotional weight of an ungrateful, deceptive family. The charity gala had caught the attention of several prominent local business owners who attended as sponsors, and I was subsequently offered a massive promotion at a leading regional logistics firm. I moved out of my cramped, peeling apartment and rented a beautiful, sunlit loft in the city. I never dyed my hair a dull, flat brown ever again. My vibrant auburn waves remained a constant daily reminder that I would never again alter my true self to make someone else comfortable. I often reflect on this incredible psychology of my family dynamic. For decades, I had been trapped in the toxic role of the designated scapegoat, constantly sacrificing my own resources, while my sister occupied the untouchable position of the golden child. I had foolishly believed that if I simply gave enough, worked hard enough, and solved enough of their problems, they would eventually realize my true value and love me. I had to learn the hardest lesson of all. Love is not a transactional currency. You cannot purchase basic respect from people who fundamentally view you as an object to be exploited. True power does not come from quietly enduring abuse. It comes from recognizing your own inherent worth, setting absolute boundaries, and having the courage to walk away from anyone who attempts to diminish your light. My parents thought they were stealing my financial future, but all they really did was force me to finally open my eyes and take my entire life back. If you are listening to this story right now and you recognize your own struggles in my journey, I want you to know that you are absolutely not alone. If you have ever been the invisible provider for a family that completely overlooked your worth, or if you have ever been told that your personal boundaries are an act of betrayal, I completely understand your deep pain. I want to ask you a very important question today. Would you have had the courage to legally transfer that expensive wedding to a charity, or would you have simply walked away and cut your losses? Please drop your honest thoughts in the comments below because I read every single one of them. Also, please let me know what city you are watching from and what time it is there. If my journey to find justice and self-respect resonated with you, please hit that like button and make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another empowering story. Remember that you do not need permission to protect your own peace. You are entirely worthy of respect, and you hold the absolute power to rewrite the ending of your own story. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. The heavy mahogany doors of the Montgomery Valley Country Club swung open, but this time I was not dragging crushed cardboard boxes through a damp service entrance. It was Saturday evening, exactly 24 hours after my mother had opened that devastating black velvet box, and the atmosphere inside the grand ballroom was entirely transformed. The oppressive, suffocating tension of high society expectations had completely vanished. In its place was a radiant, undeniable warmth. I walked into the Magnolia Room, and I was certainly not wearing a shapeless beige dress. I wore a stunning floor-length emerald green gown that swept elegantly across the polished hardwood. My auburn hair, freshly stripped of that terrible dull brown dye, cascaded over my shoulders in vibrant, loose waves. I was not hiding in the shadows near the swinging kitchen doors. I stood right in the very center of the magnificent room, holding a glass of sparkling cider, entirely visible and completely unashamed. The $45,000 private event was in full glorious swing. The towering arrangements of imported white orchids and hydrangeas filled the air with a sweet, luxurious fragrance. The live classical string quartet was playing a bright, joyful symphony in the corner. But the most beautiful part of the evening was not the expensive decor or the crystal chandeliers. It was the guests. Dozens of women and children from the Hope Haven domestic violence shelter filled the tables. These were individuals who had survived unimaginable trauma, people who had fled terrifying circumstances with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Tonight they were being treated like absolute royalty. I watched a group of young mothers laughing freely as the 5-star catering staff served them perfectly seared imported Wagyu beef and delicate handcrafted pastries. I saw children in donated party clothes twirling happily on the dance floor, their faces lit up with pure, unadulterated joy. The head chef, clearly inspired by the profound shift in the purpose of the evening, had personally designed a spectacular dessert presentation. He wheeled out the massive 5-tier cake that was originally intended for Chloe, beautifully redecorated with bright, colorful sugar flowers and a message of hope and resilience. The room erupted into genuine thunderous applause as the children rushed forward to get the first slices. Standing there amidst the laughter and the music, a profound realization washed over me, completely washing away the last lingering traces of my childhood conditioning. For my entire life, I had believed that family was an unbreakable bond, an absolute obligation that required infinite sacrifice. I had allowed my parents and my sister to exploit my loyalty, convinced that my own boundaries were a form of selfish betrayal. I had shrunk myself down, handed over my life savings, and accepted their casual cruelty because I thought that was the mandatory price of admission to their inner circle. But watching the incredible survivors around me, people who had bravely walked away from their own abusers, I finally understood the truth. Blood does not give anyone a free pass to completely destroy your dignity. You do not owe your resources, your mental health, or your future to people who only view you as a convenient tool for their own selfish gain. Cutting off the funding to my toxic relatives was not an act of vindictive revenge. It was a necessary act of survival. That evening at the charity gala was the definitive end of my old life and the beautiful, empowering beginning of my new one. It has been exactly 1 year since that weekend, and the level of peace I experience on a daily basis is still astonishing to me. Once I stopped pouring all of my physical and emotional energy into a bottomless pit of familial manipulation, my life began to flourish in ways I had never thought possible. Professionally, the charity event caught the attention of several highly influential business leaders who had attended as sponsors. Impressed by my meticulous organizational skills and my unyielding ethical backbone, one of them recruited me to join their corporate logistics firm. Today, I am no longer just a background payroll manager. I am the regional director of financial operations, earning a salary that more than makes up for the money I spent on that remarkable gala. 6 months ago, I achieved the dream my parents had actively tried to steal from me. I bought my own home. It is a beautiful, light-filled house with a sprawling backyard and a wide front porch. There is no beige anywhere in the decor. Every room is painted in bright, welcoming colors. It is a sanctuary that belongs entirely to me, purchased with my own hard-earned money, entirely free from the shadow of the greedy expectations of anyone else. I have surrounded myself with a brilliant circle of friends and colleagues who respect my boundaries, celebrate my successes, and value my presence. We host dinner parties where everyone is treated equally and nobody is ever banished to the kitchen. I have built a chosen family that understands that true love is fundamentally based on mutual respect, not constant one-sided sacrifice. As for my biological relatives, their empire of lies collapsed entirely under the weight of their own arrogance. The Montgomery family made absolutely certain that Richard, Susan, and Chloe were permanently exiled from the local high society scene. To avoid a massive civil lawsuit over the ruined rehearsal dinner and the canceled luxury honeymoon, my parents were forced to sell their precious Florida boat at a catastrophic financial loss. Chloe is still living in her childhood bedroom, endlessly complaining about her ruined reputation to parents who are too bitter and resentful to comfort her. I do not feel any guilt about their current miserable reality. I simply left them to deal with the natural consequences of their own incredibly toxic choices. If you are listening to this right now, and you are currently acting as the designated emotional sponge or the financial safety net for a family that completely disrespects you, I want you to hear this loud and clear. You are not a burden. Your boundaries are not a betrayal. You do not have to set yourself on fire simply to keep toxic people warm. It takes immense bravery to walk away from the people who raised you, but the absolute peace you will find on the other side of that difficult choice is worth more than any amount of money in the world. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this journey. If my story of finding justice and reclaiming my self-worth resonated with you today, please do me a huge favor and hit that like button. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another empowering story about standing up for what is right. I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts on this situation. Have you ever had to enforce a massive boundary with a manipulative family member? Please drop a comment below and share your own experiences. I read every single one of your messages. Also, do not forget to tell me what city you are watching from and exactly what time it is there right now. I love seeing where my stories reach across the world. Remember that you have the absolute right to write your own ending, and you never ever have to accept a seat at the back of the room. Until next time, take beautiful care of yourself and protect your peace. The dust has finally settled on my past, leaving me with a profound sense of clarity. Looking back at the woman shivering in the freezing rain on that concrete loading dock, I almost do not recognize her. She was so desperately eager to purchase affection that she was willing to completely bankrupt her own future just to buy a momentary illusion of family. But her intense pain bought me my ultimate freedom. It taught me that genuine love cannot be bought, and it certainly cannot be demanded through cruel ultimatums. If you are watching this video right now, and you recognize fragments of your own life in my story, I need you to listen to me very carefully. If you have been the designated family wallet, the one everyone expects to quietly foot the bill while receiving absolutely no gratitude in return, you are not alone. If you have spent your entire life acting as the acceptable sacrifice, the person who gives everything they possess, only to be handed a list of humiliating conditions in exchange, I want you to know something incredibly important. You have the absolute right to close your checkbook. You have the undeniable right to stand up, turn around, and walk away from the toxic table. People who truly love you will never view you as a personal automated teller machine. They will never measure your inherent value by the balance of your savings account or your willingness to absorb their fabricated crises. We are so often conditioned to believe that family means enduring absolutely anything, and that walking away makes us the terrible villain of the story. But setting a firm boundary is not an act of betrayal. It is a necessary act of basic survival. Protecting your peace, your hard-earned finances, and your mental health is the most courageous thing you can possibly do. You do not owe your life or your loyalty to people who only see you as a convenient stepping stone for their own selfish vanity. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this journey. Sharing this reality was not easy, but I knew I had to speak my truth aloud to help others. If my story touched you in any way, or if it gave you the courage to face your own difficult situation, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell. I would absolutely love to hear from you directly. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your own future? Have you ever realized that the people you loved were simply using you for their own gain? Please share your personal experience in the comments section below. Do not forget to tell me what city you are watching from and what time it is there right now. I read every single comment, and your shared stories constantly inspire me. Until next time, please remember one vital, undeniable truth. Your worth is not defined by what manipulative people can extract from you. Your worth is inherent, and you deserve a life filled with genuine respect and true peace. Take beautiful care of yourselves.